The wisdom paradox. Imagine spending years studying a subject, reading every book you can find, talking to everyone who knows more than you, building what feels like a solid foundation of understanding. And then one morning you wake up and realize that the more you have learned, the less certain you are about almost everything. The experts you admired turned out to disagree with each other. The facts you memorized turned out to have exceptions. The frameworks you trusted turned out to break down at the edges. And the people who seem the most confident about everything, almost without exception, the ones who have read the least. This is the wisdom paradox. Knowledge does not lead to certainty. Knowledge leads to the recognition of how much uncertainty exists. And the further you travel into any subject, the more clearly you can see how vast the territory is that you have not yet touched. Socrates understood this about 2,500 years ago in Athens. He was considered the wisest man in Greece, a title he found genuinely puzzling because he was acutely aware of how little he knew. His explanation was that other people were equally ignorant but did not know it. He at least knew that he did not know. And that self-awareness, that recognition of the limits of his own understanding, was apparently enough to distinguish him from everyone else. Whether Socrates was being modest or genuinely humble is something historians have debated for centuries. What is harder to debate is the structure of the paradox he was pointing at. Wisdom does not look like confidence. Wisdom looks like the slow accumulation of questions that replace the answers you thought you had. Imagine meeting two people. One has read broadly, studied deeply, encountered the full complexity of a topic, and speaks carefully, qualifies their statements, admits uncertainty at the edges. The other has read a single book on the subject or watched a few videos and speaks with total confidence about exactly what is true and what is false. In most social settings, the second person sounds more authoritative. People are drawn to certainty. Confidence reads as expertise even when it is the opposite of it. This creates a strange social problem. The people most qualified to speak about complex subjects are often the least willing to make sweeping claims because they know the territory well enough to know where the claims break down. The people least qualified are often the most willing to make those claims precisely because they have not yet encountered the complications. And audiences who cannot easily tell the difference often prefer the confident voice over the careful one. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who spent decades studying how people make decisions, described something he called "what you see is all there is." When you have limited information about a subject, your brain constructs a coherent story from what is available and presents it to you as a complete picture. You do not experience the absence of what you do not know. You just experience a story that feels whole. The more you learn, the more clearly you can perceive the holes in that story, the things you do not know that you do not know. And that perception of holes is genuinely uncomfortable, because it means the clean story you had before is gone and has been replaced by something more accurate, but also more uncertain. Imagine being a beginning chess player. At that stage, the game seems relatively manageable. You know the basic moves, you have a few patterns you use, and you feel like you understand what is happening. Then you study more. You start to see combinations you had never noticed before. You start to understand how much your early games were built on luck and your opponent's mistakes rather than your own skill. And you realize, with some discomfort, that the confident beginner you used to be had no idea what they did not know. Advanced chess players report something similar after even more study. At the highest levels, the game opens into a complexity that makes the intermediate player's confidence look almost charming. There is always more to see. There is always another layer of understanding that the current layer of understanding cannot yet perceive. Whether this curve eventually flattens, whether there is some point of mastery at which genuine confidence returns, is something that experts in different fields answer differently. Some describe a return of confidence after deep enough immersion, a kind of hard-won certainty that has been tested against enough complications to feel reliable. Others describe an ongoing deepening of uncertainty that never fully resolves. Both accounts seem to be true in different domains and for different people. What does seem consistent is that the early confidence, the certainty of the beginner, is almost always misplaced. Not because beginners are foolish, but because they have not yet encountered enough of the subject to know what they are missing. And the middle stage, where the confident beginner transforms into the uncertain intermediate, is often more uncomfortable than either the beginning or the eventual arrival at something more grounded. Imagine sitting with someone who has spent 40 years becoming one of the foremost experts in their field and asking them a question you think has a simple answer. The pause before they respond, the careful qualifications they add, The ways they circle around the edges of what they actually know versus what they suspect can initially feel like evasiveness. Over time, you start to understand that the pause and the qualifications are not evasiveness. They are the most honest thing you can do with a hard question. Whether the wisdom paradox feels like a problem or a comfort probably depends on where you are in your own learning. For the person just beginning, it is a prediction that their current confidence will not survive contact with more knowledge. For the person who has already lost that early confidence and is sitting somewhere in the uncertainty, it might be reassuring to know that what they are experiencing is not a failure of understanding, but a sign that understanding is actually happening. Bertrand Russell, the mathematician and philosopher, wrote that the trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. He was not being cruel about intelligence. He was describing the same curve. People who have not encountered the complexity of a subject feel no need to doubt their understanding of it. People who have spent years inside the complexity know exactly how much room for doubt there is and feel it constantly. Whether this creates a permanent disadvantage for the careful thinker in a world that rewards confidence is a real question. Some environments genuinely do reward the performance of certainty regardless of whether the certainty is earned. And in those environments, the wisdom paradox is not just philosophically interesting, but practically costly. The person who says, "I am not sure, and let me think about that," loses ground to the person who says absolutely, and here is exactly what you should do, even when the first person has a far better grasp of the actual situation. Imagine a world where the most trusted voices were the ones who were most comfortable saying they did not know. What would that change about which people ended up in positions of influence, and what would it change about the quality of the decisions made at those positions? Whether that world is achievable or just a thought experiment is itself a question without a confident answer. There is also a generational dimension to the wisdom paradox that tends to surface in conversations between people at very different stages of their lives. Young people often describe older people as rigid and set in their ways, unwilling to update their beliefs. Older people often describe younger people as overconfident about things they have not yet tested against reality. Both observations can be true simultaneously, and the tension between them is partly a tension between different points on the wisdom curve. Somewhere in the middle of a long life, if things go well, a person discovers that their certainties were mostly borrowed from their environment, absorbed from the people around them before they had enough experience to evaluate them. What replaces those borrowed certainties is something slower and quieter, built from actual contact with how things work, and far less comfortable to carry around than the original confidence was. Imagine carrying a question instead of an answer for an entire decade. Not because you are avoiding the answer, but because every time you think you have found it, something new arrives that makes the question more interesting. Whether that is wisdom, or just the particular shape of a certain kind of mind, is something only time seems to settle. What was the last question you sat with long enough to actually change what you thought about something? And was the change comfortable? Or did it feel like losing something you had not expected to miss? Most people never sit long enough to find out. The happiness paradox. Imagine deciding, seriously and with full intention, that you are going to be happy. Not in some vague future sense, but starting now. As a project you are going to pursue deliberately and track carefully. You are going to do the things that are supposed to produce happiness, avoid the things that produce its opposite, and measure your progress. You are going to optimize for it, the way you would optimize for anything else you care about. Most people who try this find that it does not work. And not just that it does not work well, but that it actively makes things worse. The more deliberately you pursue happiness as a direct goal, the more aware you become of its absence. Every moment that does not feel sufficiently happy becomes evidence of failure. Every activity gets evaluated for its happiness yield, and the evaluation itself produces a kind of anxious monitoring that is almost the opposite of the relaxed engagement that happiness actually requires. John Stuart Mill discovered this in his own life at the age of 20, in a crisis that lasted months. He had been trained from early childhood by his father to be a calculating machine of rational self-improvement, and he had succeeded extraordinarily well by every external measure. He was educated, accomplished, and committed to the utilitarian goal of maximizing happiness for humanity. And then one morning, he asked himself whether achieving all those goals would actually make him happy, and the answer that came back was no. The question itself, and the no that followed it, produced a kind of internal collapse that he later described as a dryness of heart. What pulled him out eventually was not a philosophical argument, but poetry. He encountered Wordsworth and found that reading the poems produced something in him that the pursuit of happiness had not. He was not pursuing happiness when he read them. He was absorbed in something outside himself, and the absorption was what brought the happiness that pursuit had consistently failed to deliver. Mill later wrote that those who have their happiness fixed in their minds as an object of pursuit find they do not attain it, but those who are pursuing something else find that happiness comes along as a byproduct, arriving incidentally when it is no longer being watched for. Imagine two people with the same external circumstances. One of them is tracking their happiness carefully, asking themselves regularly whether they are happy, adjusting their activities based on whether each one produces enough positive feeling. The other has become absorbed in a project they find genuinely interesting and demanding, and has mostly stopped asking whether they are happy because they are too busy thinking about the project. Studies on well-being consistently find that the second person reports higher levels of life satisfaction, not because the project guarantees happiness, but because the absorption in something outside yourself removes the anxious self-monitoring that happiness-seeking tends to produce. Viktor Frankl described this from a much darker starting point. He survived the Nazi concentration camps and wrote about what he observed among the prisoners. The people who managed to hold together psychologically were rarely the ones focused most intensely on their own survival and well-being. They were the ones who had something outside themselves to hold on to, a person to return to, a work to complete, a meaning to preserve. The ones who turned entirely inward collapsed fastest. Frankl concluded that happiness cannot be pursued directly. It must result from something else. And what it results from is meaning, which is always pointed outward rather than inward. Whether this is true across all circumstances, or mainly in extreme ones, is something psychologists debate. What is harder to debate is that the mechanism Frankl and Mill both noticed, the way direct pursuit of happiness tends to undermine itself, while absorption in something meaningful tends to produce it indirectly, is consistent with what research on well-being has found more broadly. Imagine spending an afternoon doing something you found genuinely absorbing, something that required your attention and gave you just enough difficulty to keep you engaged without overwhelming you. At the end of that afternoon, you probably would not have rated each hour for its happiness content. You would have been too busy. And looking back, the afternoon would likely feel like a good one, even if you could not point to a specific moment of feeling happy during it. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called this state flow, the experience of complete absorption in a challenging activity where time distorts and self-consciousness temporarily disappears. He argued that flow experiences are among the most reliably reported sources of deep satisfaction in human life, and that the conditions for flow are almost the opposite of the conditions for happiness-seeking. Flow requires challenge, external focus, and the temporary suspension of self-evaluation. Happiness-seeking requires self-evaluation, internal focus, and the absence of challenge. What makes the happiness paradox genuinely uncomfortable is what it implies about the approach most people take to their own well-being. The advice to prioritize your happiness, to put yourself first, to make sure you are getting what you need, sounds reasonable and even caring. But if the paradox is right, that advice might be pointing people toward the very thing that makes happiness harder to find. The pursuit becomes the obstacle. Whether the solution is to stop caring about happiness entirely, or just to redirect that care toward meaning and absorption and let happiness arrive when it will, is something the paradox raises without fully resolving. Imagine happiness as something like sleep. The harder you try to fall asleep, the more awake you become. The moment you stop trying and let your attention drift to something else, sleep arrives. Whether happiness works the same way, arriving when you are looking somewhere else, is a question that your own experience is probably better at answering than any argument is. Buddhist philosophy has been pointing at a version of the happiness paradox for roughly 2,500 years, using different language but describing the same mechanism. The concept of tanha, often translated as craving or thirst, describes the mind's habitual reaching toward pleasant states and away from unpleasant ones. On the Buddhist analysis, this reaching is itself the source of suffering, not because pleasant things are bad, but because the act of reaching for them creates an anxious attachment that poisons the experience of having them. You get the thing and immediately begin worrying about losing it, or you notice it is slightly different from what you imagined, or you find that having it has already shifted your reference point, so that the satisfaction you expected does not quite land. The proposed solution is not to stop wanting things but to change your relationship to wanting, to hold preferences lightly enough that they do not become the scaffolding your entire well-being depends on. Whether this is achievable through ordinary life or requires dedicated contemplative practice is something Buddhism has different answers to in different traditions. Arthur Schopenhauer arrived at a darker version of the same observation from a Western philosophical direction. He believed that desire and satisfaction operated on an asymmetric schedule. Desire is long, persistent, and uncomfortable. Satisfaction is brief and quickly replaced by new desire or by boredom, which he saw as desire's mirror image. On his reading, the life spent pursuing happiness is a life spent mostly in the discomfort of not yet having what you want, punctuated by brief moments of having it before the cycle begins again. Whether Schopenhauer's reading is pessimistic or just accurate is a question people tend to answer based on their own experience of how the desire-satisfaction cycle actually plays out in their lives. Some people find his description recognizable and even relieving because it named something they had been experiencing without having a framework for. Others find it too bleak to be useful and prefer the more moderate versions of the paradox that suggest a path through rather than just a description of the trap. Imagine being handed a version of your life that was identical to your current one in every way except that you had stopped evaluating each moment for its happiness yield. No checking in, no monitoring, no asking whether this particular hour is making you happy enough. Just doing whatever is in front of you with whatever attention you have available. Whether that version of your life would feel better or worse than the current one is a question worth sitting with. What would you actually do differently tomorrow if you stopped trying to be happy and started trying to be absorbed? And is there a version of those two things that is the same thing, or are they genuinely different directions to move in? Happiness seeking and meaning seeking look similar from the outside, but feel completely different from the inside. One keeps you watching yourself, the other lets you forget yourself for a while, and forgetting yourself might be the closest most people get to what they were looking for. The Paradox of Hedonism. Imagine being told that the one thing you want most in life is guaranteed to move further away from you the moment you start running toward it. Not because the thing is impossible or because you are not capable of having it, but because the act of running toward it is precisely what keeps it at a distance. You could have it if you stopped running, but stopping feels like giving up, and giving up is the last thing you are willing to do when the thing you want is happiness itself. This is not a metaphor designed to sound wise. It is a description of a mechanism that psychologists have documented extensively and that philosophers noticed long before psychologists had tools to measure it. Happiness, in its deepest form, does not respond to direct pursuit. Chase it as a goal, and it retreats. Stop chasing it, and it sometimes arrives, quietly, while you were looking somewhere else. The word hedonism comes from the Greek hedonon, meaning pleasure. Classical hedonists believed that maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain was the highest possible aim for a human life. Later utilitarian philosophers like Jeremy Bentham turned this into a formal framework, arguing that the goal of ethics was to produce the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people, and that pleasure could in principle be measured and optimized. What neither the ancient hedonists nor the early utilitarians fully reckoned with was the feedback loop between wanting pleasure and getting it. Wanting pleasure intensely, monitoring whether you are experiencing enough of it, adjusting your behavior to maximize its presence, these activities introduce a level of self-consciousness and anxiety that are themselves aversive. You cannot be absorbed in an experience while simultaneously evaluating whether it is pleasurable enough. The evaluation crowds out the absorption. And absorption, it turns out, is what most pleasurable experiences actually require. Imagine eating a meal you have been anticipating for weeks. Now imagine that throughout the meal you are rating each bite on a scale of 1 to 10, tracking whether the experience is living up to your expectations, noting where it falls short, updating your assessment of whether the evening is going well. The rating process would not leave the experience unchanged, it would fundamentally alter it, extracting you from the experience just enough to prevent you from fully entering it. Pleasure works best when it is not the thing you are trying to produce. A conversation that becomes genuinely engaging stops being an activity you are performing and becomes something you have entered, and the pleasure of it is a property of having entered rather than a reward you receive for entering. Music that catches you pulls you out of your ordinary relationship with time and self, and the catch is exactly the thing that makes it pleasurable, not a separate reward for listening carefully. What the paradox of hedonism asks you to notice is that your best experiences have almost certainly shared this quality of unself-conscious engagement. You were in them, rather than watching yourself be in them. And the paradox is that creating the conditions for more of those experiences requires not pursuing them directly, but creating the conditions for absorption, which is a different kind of project entirely. Robert Nozick, the philosopher who invented the experience machine thought experiment, used a related line of reasoning to challenge simple hedonism. He asked people to imagine a machine that could give them any experience they chose, perfectly simulated, indistinguishable from reality. You could plug in and live whatever life you wanted, experiencing all the pleasures it contained, without any of the difficulty or uncertainty of actual life. He argued that most people would refuse the machine, even if the simulated pleasures were identical to real ones, and that this refusal reveals something important about what human beings actually value. People want to actually do things, not just have the experience of doing them. They want their relationships to be real, not simulated. They want their achievements to be genuine, not scripted. If pleasure were truly the only thing that mattered, the machine would be the obvious choice. The fact that it is not suggests that something other than pleasure is doing significant work in what makes a life feel worth living. Imagine being offered a version of your life that was slightly less pleasurable on average, but more genuinely engaged, more connected to things that actually happened and people who actually existed, with real difficulty and real uncertainty and real failure alongside the real satisfactions, against a version that was more pleasurable on average, but more disconnected, more simulated, more managed, with the rough edges smoothed away and the surprises removed. Most people choose the first version, and choosing it is itself a demonstration of the paradox. The most fully human version of a life is not the one that maximizes pleasure, but the one that maximizes genuine engagement with whatever the life actually contains. And genuine engagement, done right, produces pleasure as a byproduct rather than as an objective. Whether this means you should stop trying to enjoy things is not what the paradox is saying. Enjoying things is fine. Pursuing enjoyment as the primary aim of each moment is what tends to crowd out the enjoyment itself. What is the most pleasurable thing you did in the last month? And were you trying to have a pleasurable experience when it happened, or were you just doing something that caught you? And does the answer to that question tell you anything about where to put your attention next? There is a version of the paradox of hedonism that shows up specifically in how people relate to vacations and leisure time. Most people, when they describe what they are looking forward to about a vacation, describe rest and relaxation and pleasure. And many people find that the vacations they remember most vividly and feel best about in retrospect were not the ones where they were most thoroughly rested and relaxed, but the ones where something unexpected happened, where they had to figure something out, where they were genuinely engaged with an unfamiliar place or situation. The perfectly managed vacation, where everything goes smoothly and there are no surprises and you move from one pleasurable experience to the next on a tight itinerary, often produces a kind of flatness. The chaotic one with the wrong hotel, and the missed train, and the unexpected conversation with a stranger in a cafe produces stories and a strange kind of aliveness. Whether this means you should deliberately introduce difficulties into your leisure is not quite the right conclusion. It means that the conditions that produce good experiences are not the same as the conditions that seem like they should produce good experiences from the outside. Difficulty and uncertainty and genuine engagement tend to produce better memories than comfort and smoothness and optimal management. Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow pointed at the same thing from a different angle. Flow experiences, which people consistently describe as among their best, require challenge. Not overwhelming challenge, but enough challenge that you have to actually bring yourself to meet it. Pure relaxation does not produce flow. Challenge without skill produces anxiety. But the right balance, where your skill is genuinely being stretched by something worth stretching toward, produces what people retrospectively call their best hours. Imagine designing your life around the conditions for flow rather than the conditions for comfort, and noticing whether the result felt more or less like the life you actually wanted. Whether the paradox of hedonism is ultimately a prescription for how to live, or just a description of how things tend to work, is something you can only really test against your own experience. What would you do differently this week if you were trying to create the conditions for genuine absorption rather than the conditions for maximum comfort? And do those two things point in the same direction or in different ones? The hedonic treadmill is the name psychologists give to the adaptation process that returns people to a roughly stable level of well-being after both positive and negative changes in their circumstances. Lottery winners return to their baseline happiness within a year or two. People who experience serious injuries or illness also tend to return to a baseline that is often higher than outside observers would predict. The treadmill keeps running regardless of what happens, which means that if pleasure is your target, you are on a treadmill you cannot step off. What you can do, according to the research, is invest in experiences rather than possessions, in relationships rather than status, in activities that produce engagement rather than comfort. None of these are guarantees, but they are better bets than the direct pursuit of pleasure, because they create the conditions for the kind of absorption that tends to generate satisfaction as a byproduct rather than as a destination. Imagine treating your own well-being as a byproduct of how you live rather than as the goal of how you live. Whether that shift in framing would change anything about your actual choices is a question worth sitting with before the week gets busy again. The observer's paradox. Imagine being asked to describe exactly how you walk. Not a general description, but the precise sequence. Which muscle fires first? How your weight shifts from heel to toe? What your arms do relative to your legs? How your breathing coordinates with your stride? Most people, when they try to answer this question in real time while actually walking, find that the walking gets worse. The act of observing it interrupts it. What was automatic becomes effortful. What was smooth becomes slightly mechanical. This is a version of the observer's paradox, and it turns up in places far beyond movement. Anytime you turn your attention towards something that was running smoothly without attention, the attention itself changes what you find. Not because attention is bad, but because certain things only work well when they are not being watched. William Labov, the linguist who spent decades studying how people actually speak versus how they think they speak, described the paradox in terms of language. He wanted to understand the natural vernacular, the speech people use when they are relaxed and not monitoring themselves. But every time he tried to observe it, the speakers would shift toward more formal, more careful speech, because they knew they were being observed. The very data he was trying to collect transformed itself in response to his attempts to collect it. His solution was partial and ingenious. He would ask people to tell him about a time when they thought they were going to die. The emotional intensity of remembering a near-death experience pulled speakers out of their formal register and into something more natural, because the body took over from the self-conscious mind. He could gather a few minutes of authentic speech before the formality crept back in. Whether this counts as solving the problem or just temporarily outrunning it is a fair question. Imagine sitting down to write something creative that you care about. You have been thinking about it for weeks, and you know roughly what you want to say. You open a blank document and begin, and then you read what you have written, and you think about whether it is good enough, and you wonder how it will land, and you imagine the audience reading it, and you revise the first sentence 17 times. Hours pass. The blank document is still mostly blank. Now imagine the version where you open the document and just write, without reading back, without evaluating, without imagining the audience, just following the thought wherever it goes. Many writers describe this as the only way they can actually get a first draft done. The observing mind, the part that evaluates and judges and imagines how things will be received, is useful for editing. During the initial creation, it tends to strangle the thing it is trying to help. Athletes describe something similar when they talk about choking under pressure. The mechanism of choking is not a failure of skill. It is a failure caused by too much attention to skill. When a basketball player starts thinking about the precise mechanics of their free throw at the moment they are shooting it, they are introducing a layer of self-observation that the automatic system cannot accommodate. The skill was built through repetition into something that runs below conscious attention. Pulling it back up into conscious attention disrupts it. Psychologists call this the ironic process theory in some contexts, building on research by Daniel Wegner. When you try very hard not to think about something, you tend to think about it more. When you try very hard to perform something flawlessly, the effort of trying introduces exactly the errors you are trying to avoid. The monitoring meant to prevent failure creates the conditions for it. What makes the observer's paradox life-changing rather than just interesting is what it suggests about where your attention is most usefully placed. Many people have been taught to pay attention to themselves, to monitor their performance, to evaluate how they are coming across, to check in regularly on whether they are doing well, and some of this is genuinely useful. But beyond a certain point, the monitoring becomes the obstacle. Imagine spending a day in which you were fully absorbed in whatever was in front of you, without any background monitoring of how you were doing or how you were being perceived. Most people who have had days like that describe them as some of their best, not because nothing went wrong, but because the absence of self-monitoring created a quality of presence that the monitored version of themselves rarely achieves. Whether there is a way to turn off the observing mind deliberately, or whether it only turns off when something else absorbs it completely, is something different people answer differently. Meditation practices in various traditions are partly aimed at teaching people to observe their own observing, to become aware of the monitoring process without being caught inside it. Whether that helps or just adds another layer of watching is something practitioners report differently. The paradox does not resolve cleanly into a rule about when to observe and when not to. Some things genuinely benefit from careful attention, others genuinely suffer from it. Learning which is which, for your own particular skills and contexts and tendencies, is probably a project that takes longer than any single insight can shortcut. Imagine watching yourself read these words right now, and noticing what that watching does to the reading. Whether the words land differently when you are watching yourself receive them versus when you are just receiving them, is a small version of the same paradox that shows up everywhere. When was the last time you did something so well that you were not thinking about yourself at all? And what would change if you could create those conditions more often without waiting for them to arrive on their own? There is a social version of the observer's paradox that most people recognize immediately once it is named. Imagine being at a party where you do not know many people, and spending the first hour acutely aware of how you are coming across. You are monitoring your body language, calibrating your humor, tracking whether people seem engaged by what you are saying, adjusting your volume and your pacing based on constant internal feedback loops. And somehow, despite all this effort, the conversations feel slightly off, slightly effortful, slightly less than they should be. Then at some point something shifts. Someone says something that genuinely interests you, or the conversation takes a turn you did not expect, and suddenly you have stopped monitoring and started actually talking, and the conversation, freed from the monitoring, becomes the thing you had been trying to engineer it into being. The monitoring was not helping. It was producing exactly the slightly effortful quality it was trying to prevent. The naturalness it was trying to create was impossible to create through effort, because naturalness is by definition what happens when effort stops. Whether this means you should try to stop monitoring is where the paradox gets tricky. Trying to stop monitoring is itself a form of monitoring. You cannot force unself-consciousness any more than you can force sleep. What you can do is give your attention something genuinely interesting to go toward, and trust that when attention has somewhere to go, the monitoring tends to quiet down on its own. Most people have had the experience of walking into a room and being acutely self-conscious, and then being told something that required their full attention to process, and finding that the self-consciousness vanished without effort the moment their attention was genuinely claimed. The observer's paradox is partly a reminder that the cure for too much self-attention is not less attention, but better direction of the attention you have. Imagine a version of your social life where you were less focused on how you were coming across and more focused on what the other person was actually saying. Whether the conversations would be better and whether you would come across better in them as a byproduct is something you probably already know the answer to. What would happen to the way other people experience you if you stopped trying to manage how they experience you? And is the reason you have not tried this a fear of what you would find or a fear of what you might lose? There is one more version of the observer's paradox worth sitting with before moving on. Imagine trying to observe your own happiness to see whether you are happy. The observation itself shifts what you find. A moment that was going fine becomes a moment being evaluated for fineness, which is a different kind of moment, and the evaluation tends to subtract something from whatever was there before the evaluation started. This is why the happiness paradox and the observer's paradox are cousins. Both point at the same underlying feature of conscious experience, that the self-conscious mind, turned on certain things, tends to disrupt exactly what it is trying to examine, and that some of the best experiences of being alive are the ones where the self-conscious mind was somewhere else or nowhere at all, and something just happened without being watched into being. Whether you can engineer more of those moments, or whether they only arrive when the watching stops on its own, is a question the paradox cannot answer for you. Newcomb's Paradox. Imagine walking into a room and finding two boxes on a table. A being of extraordinary predictive ability has already made its decision about what to put inside them. Box A is transparent and contains $1,000. You can see it clearly. Box B is opaque and contains either $1 million or nothing at all. You have two choices. Take both boxes or take only box B. Before you arrived, the being made a prediction about which choice you would make. If it predicted you would take only box B, it placed $1 million inside it. If it predicted you would take both boxes, it left box B empty. And the being has an almost perfect track record. Every previous person who took both boxes found box B empty. Every previous person who took only box B found the million. Now make your decision. Two completely different lines of reasoning lead to opposite conclusions, and both feel convincing in a way that is difficult to fully dismiss. The first says to take only box B. The being has been right every time. If you take both boxes, it almost certainly predicted that, and the million is not there. If you take only box B, it almost certainly predicted that, and the million is waiting. Take box B. The second says to take both boxes. Whatever is in box B is already there. The being made its prediction before you arrived. You cannot change what is in box B by your choice now. If the million is in there, you get it whether you take one box or two. Plus you get the extra 1,000 from box A. If it is not in there, taking both boxes at least gets you something. Either way, taking both boxes at least gets you something. Either way, taking both boxes at least gets you something. Either way, taking both boxes at least gets you something. Either way, taking both boxes. The first argument is based on what philosophers call evidential decision theory. Your choice is evidence about what the being predicted. Choosing both boxes is evidence that box B is probably empty. Choosing one box is evidence it probably has the million. The second argument is based on causal decision theory. What matters for rational choice is not what your action is evidence of, but what your action causally produces. Your choice now cannot causally affect what was placed in the box before you arrived. So the rational move is the one that gets you more in every possible scenario. Most philosophers who study this problem lean toward taking both boxes on causal grounds. Most ordinary people who hear the problem for the first time lean toward taking only box B. Whether that gap reflects something important about the difference between formal reasoning and common sense is itself a question philosophers argue about. Imagine sitting in front of the boxes right now, knowing the being's track record, knowing both arguments. What you choose probably reveals something about which kind of rationality you trust more, the kind that responds to patterns and evidence, or the kind that insists that causes must flow forward in time and that the past cannot be changed by present choices. What makes Newcomb's paradox genuinely life-changing, rather than just philosophically interesting, is what it reveals about decision-making in ordinary life. Most significant decisions are not made in the clean, isolated conditions the puzzle describes. They are made in environments full of signals about how other people will respond to your choices, where your choice is both evidence of your character and a cause of future events, and where the two considerations often pull in different directions. When someone who knows you well predicts what you will do in a difficult situation, and you know they have predicted it, and you are deciding what to do, you are in a softer version of Newcomb's problem. Do you make the choice that your pattern of past behavior predicts, or do you make the choice that is best given the current situation, even if it contradicts what the predictor expects? Whether you think of yourself as someone who can surprise a good predictor, or as someone whose choices are largely determined by who you already are, is not just a philosophical position. It is a belief about your own agency that shapes every significant choice you make. Imagine the being predicting your choice perfectly because it has studied you closely enough to know exactly how you reason about decisions like this one. Whether that feels like a form of being known or a form of being controlled is something different people experience very differently. Some find it oddly comforting that consistent behavior makes you legible. Others find it unsettling that a sufficiently good model of you could predict your free choices with near certainty. Whether genuine freedom requires that your choices be unpredictable, or whether predictability and freedom are compatible because the prediction is based on who you genuinely are rather than on some external force overriding you, is a question that Newcomb's paradox does not settle, but does make visible in a way that is hard to look away from. What would you choose? And does the fact that the being probably already knows the answer change anything about how you feel about making the choice? Derek Parfit, one of the most important moral philosophers of the 20th century, argued that Newcomb-like problems reveal something deep about what it means to be a rational agent in a world where your psychology can be accurately modeled. He believed the puzzle pushes us toward a different and more sophisticated understanding of rationality, one that cannot be fully captured by either evidential or causal decision theory alone. His point was partly about character. An agent who has genuinely committed to a principle, who is reliably the kind of person who would always one box or always two box, is in a different situation from an agent who is deciding afresh in each encounter. The being's prediction is not just a prediction about this choice, but a prediction about what kind of decision maker you are. And what kind of decision maker you are is not just a fact about you, but something you have some capacity to shape through your choices over time. Imagine spending years developing yourself into someone who acts from principle rather than case-by-case calculation, someone whose choices in difficult situations are predictable because they flow from deeply held commitments rather than from moment-by-moment utility calculations. Whether that kind of person does better or worse in Newcomb-type situations than the careful case-by-case calculator is something the paradox explores without fully resolving. What the puzzle does do is make visible a question that most people answer without realizing they are answering it. Are you the kind of person whose choices flow reliably from who you are, or are you the kind of person who recalculates from scratch in each situation, and is one of those kinds of person better to be, or does it depend on what situation you are in? Gary Drescher argued that the correct response is to one box, based on an analysis of how rational agents should behave when they know their decision procedure can be accurately predicted. His argument is that a rational agent should choose the action that, if performed by all agents with the same decision procedure, produces the best outcome. Since all one boxers get 1,000,000 and all two boxers get only 1,000, the rational decision procedure is to one box. Whether that reasoning is compelling or whether it confuses individual decisions with policies is something philosophers continue to debate. What is clear is that after more than 60 years of serious philosophical attention, Newcomb's paradox has not been resolved in a way that satisfies everyone. If anything, it has deepened. Imagine meeting someone who has thought about Newcomb's paradox for years and still genuinely does not know what they would do. Whether that uncertainty is a failure of reasoning or an honest response to a problem that exposes a genuine gap in how we think about rationality and choice is itself a question worth holding, rather than closing too quickly. What does your answer to the box problem tell you about how you make decisions in your actual life? And is the decision maker you are in this puzzle the same decision maker you are when the stakes are real and the being doing the predicting is someone who knows you well? There is one dimension of Newcomb's paradox that rarely gets discussed in the philosophical treatments, but that tends to surface when people sit with it long enough. The being has been right about everyone. Every single person who has ever stood in front of those boxes has been predicted correctly. That is not just a high success rate. That is a statement about the nature of choice itself. If a being can predict your choice with near certainty, what does that say about how free the choice actually is? Whether the predictability of human behavior under a sufficiently accurate model is evidence against free will, or whether it is just evidence that free will is compatible with being a consistent kind of person, is a question the paradox opens without closing. Imagine standing in front of the boxes, knowing that the being knows what you will do. Whether that knowledge changes what you do, and whether your attempt to change it in response to knowing it is itself something the being predicted, is the kind of regress that tends to keep people up at night longer than the original question. What box would you take? And are you confident that you decided just now, or that you always were going to decide that? The Vulnerability Paradox. Imagine meeting two people at a social gathering. One of them has clearly prepared for the event. Their posture is controlled, their responses are measured. They reveal nothing about themselves that they have not decided in advance to reveal, and they navigate every conversation with a kind of polished smoothness that leaves you admiring their composure. The other person is less composed. At one point they admit they are nervous. At another point they tell a story that does not quite land, and they laugh at themselves. They ask a genuine question, and seem actually curious about the answer. When you leave the event, which person do you feel you actually met? Most people, if they answer honestly, say the second. The first person was impressive, the second person was real. And real, it turns out, tends to be more compelling than impressive in almost every social context. Brené Brown spent years interviewing people about shame and belonging, and what she found at the center of her research was something she had not expected to find: vulnerability. The people who reported the strongest sense of connection and belonging were consistently the ones who were willing to be seen without armor, to share things about themselves that they were not certain would be well received, to show up authentically rather than presenting a polished version designed to avoid rejection. The paradox is that this willingness to be seen as flawed or uncertain or afraid is experienced by most people as a weakness. Showing weakness feels like inviting attack, or at minimum, inviting judgment. But what actually happens in most genuine human contexts is the opposite. Vulnerability invites connection. The person who admits they are struggling invites others to admit the same. The person who shares something uncertain or tender gives others permission to do the same. And the connection that follows from that mutual exposure is almost always deeper than the connection formed between two people both performing competence at each other. Imagine telling someone something true about yourself that you have been holding back, not because you wanted sympathy, but because it was simply honest and the situation invited honesty. And then watching the other person shift slightly, their own guard dropping, the conversation moving into territory that would not have been possible a moment before. That shift is what vulnerability enables, and it cannot be engineered from the outside. Performing vulnerability, sharing calculated disclosures designed to appear authentic, produces exactly the kind of polished smoothness it is meant to avoid. What makes the vulnerability paradox genuinely difficult is that it requires a willingness to not know how the exposure will be received. Genuine vulnerability means accepting the possibility of rejection, of being judged, of having your openness met with something less than warmth, and that possibility is real. Vulnerability does not guarantee connection. What it does is make connection possible, in a way that armor never can. Armor is the word Brown uses for the strategies people develop to avoid the discomfort of being seen. Perfectionism is armor. Cynicism is armor. Humor that deflects rather than engages is armor. Busyness that prevents reflection is armor. All of these protect from the risk of genuine exposure, and all of them, over time, also protect from the rewards of genuine exposure, which is connection and belonging and the sense of being actually known by another person. Whether the armor is worth it depends on what you have decided to value. Some environments genuinely punish vulnerability. Some relationships are not safe enough for it. Some phases of life require a certain amount of protection just to get through. The vulnerability paradox is not a prescription to expose yourself in every context regardless of the cost. It is an observation about what connection requires and what the price of protection tends to be over time. Imagine carrying a version of yourself that almost no one ever sees, a self that is less certain and less composed than the one you present, that has fears you have decided not to share and questions you have decided not to ask, and softnesses you have decided to keep covered. What would happen if that self occasionally appeared in a context where it was safe to do so? Whether the response would be what you are afraid of, or something entirely different, is something most people never find out because they never quite get to the test. The research on relationships consistently finds that intimacy, the felt sense of being genuinely known by another person, requires mutual vulnerability. Two people can spend years in proximity without intimacy if neither of them allows the other to actually see them. The closeness that most people report wanting in their relationships requires a kind of risk that the protective strategies they have developed are specifically designed to avoid. Whether you have ever been genuinely known by another person, and whether the experience was as frightening or as relieving as you expected, is the kind of question that tends to reveal more about what you are actually looking for than any abstract statement about what you value. Imagine deciding to be slightly more honest this week than you usually are. Not in every conversation, not recklessly, but in one conversation where honesty seemed possible and the polished version felt slightly hollow. Whether the result would surprise you is something only the experiment can tell you. What is the thing about yourself that you most carefully manage how other people see? And what would happen if one person, just one, actually saw it? C.S. Lewis described something similar in his writing on friendship, arguing that friendship begins at the moment when one person says to another, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." The shared recognition of something private, the discovery that what you assumed was peculiar to you is also true for someone else, is what transforms acquaintance into friendship. And that recognition requires someone to go first, to name the private thing before they know whether it will be recognized or received. Going first is the vulnerability. The risk is that you name the private thing and the other person does not recognize it, and you are left exposed rather than connected. This risk is real and cannot be eliminated. What can be done is to notice that the risk of going first is the same risk that every genuine connection requires, and that a life in which no one ever goes first is a life without that particular kind of closeness. Whether that closeness is something you actively want is a question only you can answer. Some people genuinely prefer more distance and find vulnerability exhausting rather than connecting. Both are legitimate positions. What the vulnerability paradox makes visible is that if you want the connection, the armor is the thing in the way, not other people's unavailability, not bad luck, not the particular circumstances of your life, but the perfectly reasonable and understandable decision to protect yourself from the discomfort of being seen. Adam Grant, the organizational psychologist, found in his research on givers and takers that the most effective vulnerability is not performed weakness, but genuine questions. Asking for help, admitting uncertainty, acknowledging when you do not know something, these are forms of vulnerability that consistently produce better outcomes in professional and personal relationships than projecting certainty and competence. Not because people want to see you struggle, but because genuine questions invite genuine engagement in a way that polished answers do not. Imagine entering your next difficult conversation with a question instead of a position, and noticing what happens to the other person when you do. Whether the conversation goes differently, and whether the difference is in the direction you were afraid of, or in a different direction entirely, is something only the doing can show you. What is the question you have been most afraid to ask someone in your life, and what has the not asking cost you? And is the cost of asking actually higher than that? There is a version of the vulnerability paradox that shows up in creative work. The most resonant writing, the most affecting music, the art that stays with people long after they have encountered it, almost always carries some trace of genuine exposure. Not suffering performed for effect, not manufactured rawness designed to appear authentic, but something that came from a real place in the person who made it and was shared without full certainty about how it would land. The work that stays safe, that stays polished, that never risks anything, tends to leave people impressed but unmoved. The work that takes a real risk, that reveals something the maker was not sure they should reveal, tends to produce the kind of response that makes the risk feel worth it. Not always, but often enough that the correlation is hard to ignore. Imagine making something, anything, that came from a place you usually keep covered, and putting it where someone else could find it. Whether the response would be what you feared, or something else entirely, is the experiment that vulnerability requires you to actually run. And most people spend their whole lives deciding they will run it later. The later never quite arrives on its own. The Persuasion Paradox. Imagine being in an argument with someone whose position you find completely wrong. You know the facts, you have the logic, every point you make is accurate, and the conclusion follows from the premises in a way that seems undeniable. And yet the more clearly and forcefully you make your case, the more stubbornly the other person holds their position. By the end of the conversation, they are more committed to being wrong than when you started. Your argument did not change their mind, it hardened it. This is not a failure of your reasoning. It is a feature of how human minds actually respond to being argued with. And once you understand the mechanism, it becomes very difficult to unsee. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist who has spent decades studying moral reasoning, describes the conscious mind as the rider on an elephant. The elephant is the intuitive, emotional, largely unconscious system that produces most of our beliefs and values. The rider is the rational, verbal, reasoning system that we tend to think is in charge. When we form a belief, the elephant moves first. The rider's job, more often than not, is to construct a story that justifies where the elephant already went. Moral reasoning is less often a search for truth than a post hoc defense of positions the emotional system has already taken. When you argue with someone, you are talking to the rider. But the rider is employed by the elephant, and the elephant, feeling challenged by your argument, does not become more open to your position. It becomes more defensive. The rider, loyal to the elephant, works harder to find objections to your case. Your logic, however sound, has given the elephant something to push against. And elephants can push hard. Imagine trying to move a stone by pushing it directly. The friction it creates against the ground increases as you push harder. Now imagine instead finding the place where it is already slightly inclined to roll and providing the smallest nudge in that direction. The stone moves more easily, not because you applied less force, but because you aligned with the existing tendency rather than working against it. Persuasion works the same way. The most effective persuaders are not the ones who make the strongest arguments. They are the ones who listen carefully enough to find where the other person is already inclined to move and ask questions that help them discover their own inclinations. Not because this is manipulative, but because people genuinely change their minds more readily when the change feels like it originated inside them rather than being forced in from outside. Robert Cialdini, who spent decades studying the psychology of influence, found that the most persuasive technique available is not any particular argument or rhetorical device, but genuine interest in the other person's perspective. When people feel truly heard, they become more open. When they feel challenged, they close. The sequence matters enormously. Understanding before explaining, listening before arguing, finding common ground before identifying disagreement. What makes the persuasion paradox genuinely counterintuitive is that most people's instinct when they care about being right is to do exactly the wrong thing. They argue harder, they find stronger evidence, they make their position clearer, all of which is likely to produce more resistance rather than less. The caring about being right is itself part of what makes persuasion fail, because the other person can feel that the goal is winning rather than understanding. Imagine having a conversation about something you genuinely disagree about with someone you care about, and spending the first 15 minutes asking questions without sharing your own position at all. Not because you have abandoned your position, but because you are actually curious about how they arrived at theirs. Whether you would learn something that changed your thinking slightly, or whether you would find the exact place where their reasoning was most open to examination, is something most people never discover because they lead with their position before they understand the other person's. Dale Carnegie observed this dynamic nearly a century ago and wrote about it with more psychological sophistication than his self-help reputation sometimes suggests. He noted that the only way to get anyone to do anything is to make them want to do it. You cannot argue someone into wanting something. You can only understand what they already want and find out whether and how your goal connects to it. If it connects genuinely, the conversation flows. If it does not connect, no amount of argument will move them. Whether this means that persuasion is always manipulative, since it requires understanding someone's psychology well enough to work with it, is a question worth sitting with. There is a version of persuasion that is genuinely collaborative, where understanding the other person changes you as much as it changes them, where the outcome is not your original position, but something neither of you held before the conversation. That version might not be manipulative at all. It might just be what good thinking looks like when it happens between two people rather than inside one person's head. Imagine entering every difficult conversation this week as genuinely curious rather than as strategically patient. Not pretending to be curious while waiting for your turn to argue, but actually wanting to know how the other person thinks and why. Whether the conversations would go differently, and whether you would find your own positions shifting slightly as a result, is something only the attempt can reveal. What is the position you hold most firmly that you have never seriously tried to understand from the inside of the person who disagrees with it? And what would happen to your confidence in your own position if you actually did? There is a specific version of the persuasion paradox that shows up in parenting, and it is one of the places where the gap between what works and what feels right is most visible. Most parents, when they want their child to do something, or believe something, or understand something, default to telling them, explaining the reasons, making the case, and often finding that the child becomes more resistant the more the parent explains. What works more reliably is asking, not rhetorically, but genuinely, why do you think that? What would need to be different for you to feel differently about this? What does it look like from your side? These questions, asked without agenda, produce more openness than any explanation because they allow the child to arrive at a conclusion rather than receive one. And conclusions you arrive at feel like yours. Conclusions you receive feel like someone else's. The same dynamic appears in therapy, in coaching, in teaching, in management, in every context where one person is trying to change how another person thinks. The most effective practitioners in all of these fields are the ones who have learned that asking is more powerful than telling, and that understanding is more powerful than explaining. Not because the content of the explanation is wrong, but because the relationship between the explainer and the receiver makes the content land differently. William Miller and Stephen Rollnick developed a therapeutic approach called motivational interviewing specifically around this observation. They found that when therapists argued with clients about whether the clients needed to change, the clients argued back. When therapists instead asked questions that helped clients articulate their own reasons for changing, the clients were far more likely to actually change. The reasoning was the same either way. What changed was who generated it. Imagine spending 1 week in every difficult conversation asking one more question than you normally would before you share your position. Not a trick question, not a leading question, but a genuine question about how the other person sees the situation. Whether this changes the outcome of those conversations is something you would have to test. Whether it changes how you experience them is something most people report noticing almost immediately. What is the argument you have been making repeatedly that has not worked yet? The deeper point the Persuasion Paradox makes is about the nature of belief change itself. Beliefs are not primarily logical structures that can be updated by receiving better logic. They are more like ecosystems, embedded in relationships and identities and histories and emotions, and they change the way ecosystems change, slowly, through gradual shifts in the environment, rather than through sudden external interventions. This does not mean that logic is useless. Logic is how you verify a belief once the conditions for considering it have been established. But the conditions for considering a new belief are emotional and relational. People need to feel safe, heard, and respected before they are willing to genuinely examine something they have believed for a long time. Argument skips those conditions. Listening creates them. Imagine what your most important relationships would look like if you applied this genuinely rather than as a technique. Whether the conversations would be richer is something only the practice can show. And the practice always begins with one question asked more honestly than you have been asking it. The paradox of choice. Imagine walking into a store to buy jam. There are 6 varieties on the shelf. You taste a few, pick one, and leave feeling reasonably good about the purchase. Now imagine walking into a different store where there are 24 varieties of jam. You taste several, feel slightly overwhelmed. Eventually pick one and leave with a persistent nagging feeling that you might have made the wrong choice. There are 23 other jams you did not buy. What if one of them was better? Barry Schwartz, the psychologist who wrote about this phenomenon extensively, ran versions of this experiment and found that the larger selection consistently produced both lower satisfaction with the chosen option and lower likelihood of making a purchase at all. More choice, he found, is not always better. Beyond a certain point, more choice produces worse outcomes, not better ones. The mechanism is not hard to understand once it is named. When there are only a few options, choosing one feels like a reasonable response to a limited set of alternatives. When there are many options, choosing one feels like forgoing all the others. The more options you had, the more your chosen option is defined by what it is not, and the more opportunity cost you have accepted. And opportunity cost, even when it is imaginary and the unchosen jams would have been no better, tends to subtract from the satisfaction you get from the one you chose. Schwartz called the people most affected by this maximizers, people who feel compelled to find the best possible option in any given decision. Maximizers spend more time deciding, consider more options, and end up less satisfied with what they choose than satisficers, people who are happy with good enough. Satisficers are not settling in some resigned way. They have decided in advance that good enough is actually good, and that the search for optimal is a cost that is almost never worth paying. Imagine spending 2 hours choosing a movie to watch, and then being unable to enjoy the one you chose because you kept thinking about the other options. This is maximizing in its most visible form. The decision-making process itself consumed the resources that were supposed to be available for the experience of the thing decided on. The optimization ate the enjoyment it was supposed to protect. What makes the paradox of choice genuinely life-changing is that it extends far beyond jam and movies. The societies that celebrate unlimited options as pure goods are applying an assumption that the research consistently challenges. More career paths to choose from does not straightforwardly produce more career satisfaction. More potential partners available through dating apps does not straightforwardly produce better relationships. More information about every decision does not straightforwardly produce better decisions. At some point, the expansion of choice stops adding value and starts producing paralysis, regret, and a kind of diffuse dissatisfaction that is hard to name because it does not have a specific cause. You made a reasonable choice. The choice is fine. But somewhere in the back of your mind, all the unchosen options are still there, and their presence subtly colors the experience of the thing you chose. Herbert Simon, the economist and cognitive scientist, coined the term satisficing to describe what good decision-making actually looks like in complex environments. A satisficer sets a standard for what counts as an acceptable outcome and chooses the first option that meets that standard. They do not search exhaustively for the optimal choice. They stop when they have found something good enough. Simon argued that satisficing is not irrational. It is the rational response to environments where the cost of finding the optimal choice exceeds the value of having it, rather than a good enough one. Imagine applying this to one category of decisions in your life where you tend to over-search. Not every decision, and not the ones where the differences between options are genuinely significant, but the ones where good enough is actually good and the search for optimal is mainly producing anxiety. Whether your satisfaction with those decisions would improve and whether the energy freed up by stopping the search would go somewhere more useful is something only the experiment reveals. What makes the paradox complicated is that the response cannot be to eliminate all choice or to make decisions carelessly. Choice is genuinely good. Having options is genuinely better than not having them, up to a point. The paradox is not that choice is bad, but that more choice is not the same as better choice, and that treating them as equivalent is a mistake that produces real costs. Schwartz's practical suggestion was to choose when to choose, decide in advance which decisions warrant extensive search, and which decisions are fine to resolve with a satisficing approach. Save the maximizing energy for the decisions where the differences between options are large and where the time and effort of searching is genuinely worth paying. For everything else, pick something good enough and stop looking back. Imagine making your next low-stakes decision in 30 seconds instead of 30 minutes. Whether the outcome would be meaningfully worse and whether you would care about the difference is something most people discover they already know the answer to if they sit with the question honestly. What decision have you been putting off because you have not yet found the optimal option? And what would happen if good enough was enough? The paradox of choice has a particular bite in romantic relationships, which is one of the domains where the expansion of apparent options has been most dramatic, and where the effects on satisfaction have been most contested. Dating apps have given many people access to a pool of potential partners vastly larger than anything their grandparents encountered. Whether this has made it easier or harder to form lasting relationships is something researchers are still working out, but the preliminary evidence suggests a mixed picture at best. More options produce more comparison. More comparison produces less satisfaction with any given option, because the others are always present in imagination, even when one is chosen. A person who met their partner at work or through friends has a limited set of counterfactuals to compare against. A person who met their partner after reviewing hundreds of profiles is comparing them against a much larger imagined set, which tends to produce a kind of subtle dissatisfaction that has nothing to do with the actual person and everything to do with the mental presence of all the others. Whether this means that constrained choice produces better relationships, or just that the comparison process is itself the problem, regardless of how many options exist, is something the research has not fully settled. What is clearer is that the satisfaction from any given choice is partly determined by the comparison set the chooser has in mind, and that the comparison set can be managed, at least partially, by choosing when to stop looking. Esther Perel, the relationship therapist, has described something similar in how people in long-term relationships relate to the possibility of other options. The awareness that other options exist is different from the active comparison of your partner against those options. People who maintain a sense of their partner's unique value, who see them as chosen rather than as the current option, tend to report higher relationship satisfaction than people who regularly compare their partner against what else is available. Whether the way you relate to the choices you have already made, the job, the city, the relationship, the path, is itself creating a kind of discontent that the choices themselves do not deserve, is worth sitting with. Imagine treating your most important choices as settled, rather than as ongoing comparisons. Not because re-evaluation is wrong, but because the constant comparison is itself a cost. Whether doing that would change how those choices felt from the inside is something you can test before this week is over. What is the choice you keep second-guessing that you made well enough? And what would be possible if you stopped comparing it against all the options you did not take? There is one more dimension worth noting. When you have too many options and choose one, the unchosen options do not stay with you equally. Certain types linger longer. The near misses, the ones that were almost as good, the ones eliminated by circumstance rather than preference. Regret clusters around near misses rather than distant alternatives. And the more options you had, the more near misses, the ones that were almost as good, the ones eliminated by circumstance rather than preference. Regret clusters around near misses rather than distant alternatives. And the more options you had, the more near misses you accumulate. Whether considering fewer options from the start would produce fewer of those lingering regrets, and whether the freedom of having had all those options was worth the cost of carrying them afterward, is a question the JAM study cannot answer. But your own experience probably can, if you ask it honestly. Schwartz ended his book with a simple suggestion. Lower your expectations slightly, not in defeat but in realism. Good enough is often genuinely good, and optimal is often a standard that cannot be reached because the search costs more than the difference. What is one decision you have been agonizing over where good enough would be enough? And what would you do with the time if you just chose? The Friendship Paradox. Imagine asking everyone you know how many friends they have. Then imagine asking each of their friends the same question. Statistically, the friends of your friends have more friends than your friends do. Not because your friends are unusually unpopular, because of a mathematical property of social networks that produces this result regardless of the specific people involved. Your friends are, on average, more popular than you are, and this is true for almost everyone, simultaneously. Scott Feld, a sociologist, identified this in 1991 and called it the Friendship Paradox. The mechanism behind it is not complicated once you understand it, but the result feels wrong every time someone encounters it for the first time. The key is that popular people show up in more people's friend lists. When you sample your friends, you are not drawing from the population at random. You are drawing from a sample that is weighted by social connectivity. Highly connected people appear in many friend lists and therefore get counted many times. Less connected people appear in fewer friend lists and get counted fewer times. The average number of friends your friends have is therefore higher than the average number of friends anyone has, because the highly connected people are overrepresented in the sample. What this means practically is that almost everyone, looking at their own social circle, has the impression that the people around them are more socially active, more connected, and more popular than they are. And they are mostly right. Their friends are more popular than they are, on average. But so is everyone else, because everyone else is also sampling from the same weighted distribution. The friendship paradox extends beyond friendship to almost any network with unequal connectivity. On social media, your followers have more followers than you do on average. Among your colleagues, the colleagues you know tend to have more professional connections than you do. Among the people in your neighborhood, the neighbors you actually know tend to be more embedded in the neighborhood network than you are. You always seem to be on the periphery of something that other people are more at the center of. Imagine scrolling through social media and noticing that everyone seems to be at parties you were not invited to, having experiences more interesting than yours, living lives with more connection and more vitality. Some of this is curated, and the curation is real and worth accounting for. But even apart from curation, the friendship paradox means that the social worlds visible to you are going to be systematically skewed toward the highly connected people, whose lives will look more socially full than the median. Whether knowing this changes how social media makes you feel is something different people report differently. Some find it genuinely useful to know that what they are observing is a biased sample, not reality. Others find that knowing the bias does not prevent it from affecting them emotionally. The gut response to feeling peripheral tends to persist, even when the rational mind understands the mechanism producing it. Johan Uganda and colleagues at Facebook confirmed that the friendship paradox holds in very large social networks, including social media, with very high consistency. On Facebook, when they analyzed the actual network data, they found that more than 93% of users had fewer friends than their friends' average. Almost everyone was on the less connected side of the paradox, and yet most people, looking at their own feed, had the impression that everyone else was more connected. What makes this more than a curiosity is the psychological cost of the false impression. Research on social comparison consistently finds that people who compare themselves unfavorably to others report lower well-being, lower self-esteem, and higher rates of depression and anxiety. Social media has been extensively studied as a context where this kind of upward social comparison is both constant and particularly visible. And the friendship paradox is part of the reason why the comparison is systematically skewed against the viewer. Imagine knowing every time you looked at someone else's social life and felt slightly peripheral by comparison that the person you were comparing yourself to was almost certainly also making the same comparison about someone else and feeling the same thing. The highly connected people in the center of social networks are visible to everyone. The less connected people are visible only to their own smaller circles. What looks like a population of highly connected people is actually a small number of highly connected people visible to a very large number of less connected people. Whether this reframing actually helps, or whether the emotional response to social comparison runs deeper than the cognitive understanding of it, is something worth testing against your own experience. What it does at minimum is offer a more accurate picture of what you are actually seeing when social media makes the world look more connected and more happening than your own corner of it feels. Imagine looking at your social world not as a sample of what social life looks like, but as a particular corner of it, one that is genuinely yours, with whatever it contains, and without comparison to the corners that are visible to you through other people's windows. What would change about how your own social life felt if you stopped comparing it to the aggregate of everyone else's highlights? And is the version of your life that exists without that comparison smaller or larger than the version you have been evaluating? The friendship paradox also has an application to information and expertise that is less often discussed. When you sample your colleagues and peers, you tend to sample the ones you actually know, which are the ones embedded enough in the professional community to be visible to you. Those people tend to know more about the field than the average professional, so your impression of what the average professional knows is calibrated against a sample that skews toward the knowledgeable, which means you may consistently feel less knowledgeable than average, even if you are actually average or above it. Imposter syndrome, the persistent feeling of being underqualified despite external evidence to the contrary, is reported by a surprisingly large proportion of high achievers in almost every professional field. Part of its mechanism may be the friendship paradox in professional contexts. The people you know, the colleagues you compare yourself to, are a skewed sample of the field weighted toward those who are sufficiently connected and visible to appear in your professional circle. Comparing yourself to that sample produces a systematically unfavorable impression of where you stand. Whether this explains all of imposter syndrome is unlikely. Other mechanisms are certainly involved. But it suggests that some of the gap between how competent you feel and how competent you are may be at least partly a product of a mathematical feature of the social networks you inhabit, rather than an accurate reflection of your actual standing. Research on social contagion has found that behaviors, emotions, and even health outcomes spread through social networks in ways that follow similar mathematical patterns. Loneliness spreads through networks. Happiness spreads through networks. The behaviors of your friends' friends affect you even if you do not know them directly, and because the network effects propagate through the same bias structure the friendship paradox describes, the emotions and behaviors you are most exposed to tend to come from the more connected, more visible parts of the network. This has practical implications for how you choose your social environment. The people you spend time with shape not just your direct experience, but the entire sample from which you are drawing your impression of what normal looks like, what successful looks like, what connected looks like. Whether that sample is serving you well is a question worth asking more explicitly than most people do. Imagine auditing the sample. Who are the people whose lives and choices you are most regularly exposed to, and are they a representative sample of the world you actually live in, or a biased one? Whether adjusting that sample would change what feels normal and achievable is something you could find out relatively quickly if you decided to look. What does your social world look like when you stop measuring it against the sample you have been comparing it to? And is what remains smaller or actually larger than you had been assuming? Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler found that the friendship paradox can be used productively. In a flu monitoring study, the friends of random individuals consistently got sick slightly earlier because the friends were more connected and encountered the virus sooner. You could detect epidemics before they were visible in the general population, simply by monitoring people named as friends rather than people selected at random. What the friendship paradox ultimately offers is a more accurate picture of what social comparison is doing. You are not comparing yourself to the average person. You are comparing yourself to a systematically skewed sample. Knowing the skew exists is at least the beginning of a more honest relationship with what you have been measuring yourself against. The value paradox. Imagine holding a diamond in one hand and a glass of water in the other. Which one is more valuable? In a normal context, the diamond. Easily. A diamond is worth thousands of dollars. A glass of water is nearly free. And yet without water, you would be dead within days. Without diamonds, you would be fine indefinitely. The thing that is essential to your survival is almost worthless in the market. The thing that would not keep you alive for an extra hour is worth more than most people earn in a year. This is the diamond-water paradox, also called the paradox of value, and it troubled economists and philosophers for centuries before Adam Smith addressed it in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And it was not fully resolved until the development of marginal utility theory in the late 19th century. Smith himself noticed the paradox, but did not fully explain it. He pointed out that the things of greatest use often have little or no exchange value, while things of no practical value often have great exchange value. He could describe the gap, but the tools he had did not let him close it. His labor theory of value, which explained prices in terms of the labor required to produce things, could not cleanly explain why diamonds cost so much more to produce than water. The resolution came from economists like Carl Menger, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras, who independently developed what became known as marginal utility theory. The insight is that value is not determined by total usefulness, but by marginal usefulness. The usefulness of the next unit of something, given how much of it you already have. Water is extraordinarily valuable when you have none. The first glass of water, when you are dying of thirst, is worth almost everything you have. But most people in developed economies have access to more water than they can use. The marginal value of one more glass of water, when you already have abundant access to it, is close to zero. You would not pay much for it, because you do not need it particularly. Diamonds are rare. Most people have no diamonds. The marginal utility of one diamond, when you have none, is high enough that people will pay a great deal for it, even though you could survive indefinitely without it. Scarcity combined with desire produces high exchange value. Abundance combined with necessity produces low exchange value. The total utility of water is vastly higher than the total utility of diamonds. But marginal utility is what sets the price. What makes the value paradox genuinely life-changing is what it reveals about how we value things in domains far beyond economics. We tend to undervalue what we have in abundance and overvalue what we lack. The people, experiences, and resources that are readily available to us tend to fade into the background and lose their felt significance, even when they are genuinely important to our well-being. The ones that are rare, novel, or unavailable tend to occupy our attention disproportionately. Imagine thinking about the relationships you value most. The people who have been consistently present, reliably there, steadily supportive, often receive less attention and appreciation than the relationships that are exciting or new or uncertain. Not because the steady ones are less valuable, because they are abundant. You have them already. Their marginal value in the emotional economy has been driven down by their availability. This is the psychological version of the diamond-water paradox. The things that matter most to your actual well-being are often the things you take most for granted because you have them. The things you chase most urgently are often the things that, once acquired, lose most of their felt value because they become the new abundance and something else becomes the new scarcity. Seneca wrote about a version of this more than 2,000 years ago, noting that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and that we fail to enjoy what we have because we are too busy wanting what we do not have. His prescription was gratitude, specifically the practice of imagining losing what you already have before you actually lose it, as a way of restoring its marginal value to something closer to its actual value. The Stoics called this practice negative visualization, and modern psychological research has found that it works roughly as described. Imagining losing something you have, vividly and specifically, tends to produce an increase in appreciation for it. Not because the thing has changed, but because the exercise temporarily makes it feel less abundant, restoring some of the marginal value that habit and familiarity had eroded. Imagine spending 5 minutes thinking about what your life would look like without one thing you currently take for granted. Not to generate anxiety, but to reset the felt value of something that has become invisible through familiarity. Whether the thing looks different afterward is something you can test before this week is over. What is the most abundant thing in your life that you would value most if it became scarce? And is there something you have been chasing that would eventually become just as invisible as what you already have if you finally got it? Marcus Aurelius, who was simultaneously one of the most powerful men in the Roman world and one of its most thoughtful philosophers, wrote in his private journal about the difficulty of valuing what you have rather than what you lack. He noted that the mind naturally runs toward what is absent and skips over what is present, and that this tendency required active correction rather than just good intentions. His journals, now published as meditations, were not written for an audience. They were written as a daily practice of reminding himself of what actually mattered, because the reminding was necessary. Left to run on its own, his mind would drift toward what was missing the same way everyone else's does. Whether philosophical practice of any kind can permanently shift the marginal value calculation is something different people answer differently. What seems consistent is that the shift does not happen automatically. Familiarity and habituation work on everything eventually. The new house becomes the background. The relationship that seemed like a miracle becomes the norm. The health you recovered after illness becomes ordinary again within months, and the things you were chasing while those blessings were in the background move into focus, pulling attention away from what is already there. Imagine developing a practice of noticing, once a day, one thing that has become background that would not always be background. Not as a forced gratitude exercise, but as a genuine act of attention, looking at something ordinary, long enough to see what is actually there. Whether the value of that thing shifts when you look at it is something worth testing. The diamond water paradox was eventually explained by economics. The psychological version, the tendency to undervalue abundance and overvalue scarcity, has been identified and documented, but has not been solved in any comparable way. Knowing about it does not reliably prevent it. The emotional economy runs on its own logic, largely independent of what you understand about it. What the paradox does, at minimum, is provide a name for something that affects almost everyone and that most people experience as a vague dissatisfaction without being able to locate its source. You have what you need. You do not quite feel like you have what you need. The gap between having something and feeling like you have it is where the diamond water paradox lives in everyday life. Imagine asking yourself, right now, what is abundant in your life that you have stopped seeing clearly? Not the things you think you should be grateful for, but the things that, if they were suddenly gone, you would spend years trying to get back. Whether you can feel their value from the inside right now, without the hypothetical loss, is worth finding out. What would it change about today if you treated the most available things in your life as if they were rare? And is there a version of that experiment you could actually run before the week is over? Or does abundance always win in the end? Adam Smith noticed the paradox, but did not solve it. The economists who eventually explained it through marginal utility were solving a theoretical puzzle that had blocked serious economic thinking for a century. But the practical puzzle, how to actually live in a way that correctly values what you have rather than what you lack, remains as open as it ever was. What is the water in your life that you have been treating as if a diamond would be nicer to have? And does knowing the paradox change anything about how you are going to treat it tomorrow? What also tends to get overlooked is what the value paradox says about attention. Anything you give sustained, focused attention to temporarily acquires some of the scarcity that makes things feel valuable. When you choose to direct attention towards something, that something becomes rare in your life for that moment. Whether you can use this deliberately, directing attention as a way of restoring value to things that have become invisible through familiarity, is something contemplative traditions have argued for centuries. The evidence from psychology suggests they are right. Attention, carefully placed, is how ordinary things become visible again. The Paradox of Thrift. Imagine deciding, after a difficult year, that you are going to be more careful with money. You are going to spend less, save more, cut back on things that are not necessary, and build a financial cushion for whatever comes next. Every financial advisor you have ever encountered would tell you this is the right thing to do. Being prudent with money is a virtue. Saving is responsible. Getting your personal finances in order is exactly what sensible people do when times get hard. Now imagine that everyone in the country decides to do the same thing at the same time. When every household starts spending less simultaneously, the businesses that depend on that spending start losing revenue. Some of those businesses cut staff. The people who lose their jobs spend even less, which causes more businesses to lose revenue, which causes more layoffs. The savings that everyone was trying to accumulate become harder to accumulate because incomes are falling. And the economy, which looked like it needed more caution and more saving, actually ends up in worse shape than it was before everyone started being careful. This is the paradox of thrift, articulated most clearly by John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when he was trying to understand why economies could get stuck in a downward spiral despite everyone behaving, at the individual level, completely reasonably. What is sensible for each person individually turns out to be destructive when everyone does it at once. Virtue at the micro level produces a vice at the macro level. Keynes argued that government spending was the only way out of this trap. When private individuals all try to save simultaneously, someone needs to step in and spend, and only governments can do this at the scale required to break the cycle. Whether Keynesian economics is correct in all its details has been debated by economists for nearly a century, but the basic logical structure of the paradox, that individually rational behavior can produce collectively irrational outcomes, is much harder to argue with. What makes the paradox of thrift interesting beyond its economic application is the structure it reveals. There is an entire category of situations where doing the right thing for yourself becomes the wrong thing when everyone does it at once. The individual logic and the collective logic pull in opposite directions, and following one means undermining the other. Imagine everyone in a theater standing up to see the stage better. If you stand up when others are sitting, you see better. But when everyone stands up, everyone sees exactly as well as they did sitting, with significantly more discomfort. Standing up was the individually rational response to being at a disadvantage. Everyone pursuing that individually rational response produces a collectively worse situation for everyone. Economists call situations with this structure collective action problems, and they appear across almost every domain of social life. Traffic jams are collective action problems. Each driver chooses the fastest available route, and the collective result of all drivers choosing the fastest available route is that every route becomes slower. Overfishing is a collective action problem. Each boat maximizes its catch, and the collective result of all boats maximizing their catch is the collapse of the fish population that everyone depends on. Antibiotic resistance is a collective action problem. Each patient wants their doctor to prescribe antibiotics, and the collective result of all patients getting what they want is a world where antibiotics stop working. What makes collective action problems genuinely difficult is that the solution almost always requires either coordination, trust, or external enforcement, none of which is easy to produce. Each person acting individually has an incentive to defect from the cooperative solution, and without some mechanism that makes defection costly or unnecessary, the individually rational outcome tends to win. Imagine being the only person in your city who stops driving because you are worried about traffic and pollution. Your contribution to the collective problem is negligible, your personal inconvenience is real, and everyone else keeps driving exactly as before. The individually sensible response to that situation is to keep driving. But the collectively sensible response is for enough people to stop driving that the problem actually shifts. Getting from the individually sensible response to the collectively sensible one requires something that markets and individual decisions cannot produce on their own. Garrett Hardin called this the tragedy of the commons in a famous 1968 essay, describing what happens to shared resources when individuals pursue their own interest without coordination. A common pasture, available to all herders, will be overgrazed because each herder has an incentive to add one more animal, and the cost of overgrazing is shared by everyone. The pasture eventually fails, and all the herders are worse off than if each had restrained themselves. But restraining yourself when others do not is a losing strategy. So restraint is not the individually rational choice even when it is the collectively necessary one. Whether the paradox of thrift and the collective action problems it exemplifies are solvable, and through what mechanisms, is something societies are still working out. What is clearer is that the assumption that individually rational behavior produces collectively good outcomes is not a law. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it produces the opposite. And knowing which situation you are in matters enormously for figuring out what the right thing to do actually is. What is something you are doing right now that makes perfect sense from your individual perspective, but that would cause a problem if everyone in your situation did the same thing? And is the answer to that question something that changes what you think you should do? Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, partly for challenging Hardin's pessimistic analysis of the commons. She found, through decades of fieldwork studying communities around the world, that the tragedy of the commons is not inevitable. Communities have developed a wide range of institutional arrangements for managing shared resources sustainably, arrangements that do not require either privatization or government control, but that rely instead on local knowledge, informal rules, social enforcement, and a genuine sense of shared stake in the outcome. Her work is important for the paradox of thrift because it suggests that the individually rational and the collectively rational can sometimes be reconciled, but not through individual virtue alone and not through top-down coordination alone. What works is something more like community, a shared understanding of the problem, shared rules about how to manage it, and shared enforcement mechanisms that make defection costly enough that cooperation becomes individually rational. Whether the kinds of communities Ostrom studied can be created at the scales required by modern collective action problems, the scale of climate change, of antibiotic resistance, of global financial crises, is an open question that no one has answered satisfactorily. What her work does is make clear that the problem is not unsolvable in principle, even when it is unsolvable through individual virtue alone. The paradox of thrift has a more intimate version that shows up in relationships. Imagine a relationship where both people are protecting themselves emotionally, each one holding back slightly because they are worried the other will not reciprocate if they open up first. Each person's caution is individually reasonable given the uncertainty about how the other will respond. And the collective result of both people being individually reasonable is a relationship that is less connected than either of them wants it to be. The thrift of emotional self-protection produces an emotional poverty that neither person would choose if they could coordinate. What would it take to break that cycle without requiring either person to take a risk that leaves them fully exposed while the other remains protected? Whether the answer involves trust or courage, or just a different framing of what the risk actually is, it requires something more than both people continuing to behave individually rationally. What is the collective action problem in your own life where individual rationality is producing a result that nobody involved actually wants? And is there a mechanism within reach that could shift the equilibrium without requiring everyone to change at once? Keynes was not popular with everyone when he proposed that the solution to a recession was more spending rather than more saving. The intuition that during hard times you should be more careful and more frugal is deeply embedded in most people's thinking about money. At the individual level, it remains correct. At the aggregate level, during a deep recession, it can be the mechanism that keeps the recession going. Imagine seeing your own cautious behavior as part of a larger system rather than as an isolated individual choice. Whether that view changes what you think the right choice is probably depends on what problem you are actually trying to solve, and whether you think the problem is yours alone or yours and everyone else's simultaneously. The Stability-Instability Paradox. Imagine two countries facing each other across a tense border, both armed with nuclear weapons. Both governments know that a nuclear exchange would be catastrophic for both sides, destroying cities, killing millions, and producing environmental consequences that would affect the entire planet. Both sides know the other knows this, and so, paradoxically, neither side attacks. The weapons that could cause the most catastrophic possible war are also the reason the war does not happen. Nuclear weapons make large-scale conflict less likely by making it too costly to contemplate. This is one dimension of the Stability-Instability Paradox, a concept developed in strategic studies during the Cold War. The full paradox is more interesting than just mutual deterrence. If nuclear weapons make all-out war extremely unlikely, they might also make smaller conflicts more likely, because each side knows the other cannot escalate to the nuclear level without destroying itself. The very stability at the high end of the conflict spectrum creates instability at the low end. Major war becomes harder, minor war becomes easier. The umbrella that prevents catastrophe may create a sheltered space beneath it where smaller cruelties can operate more freely. Glenn Snyder, the political scientist who developed the formal concept, used the term Stability-Instability Paradox specifically to describe how nuclear deterrence might simultaneously reduce the probability of nuclear war and increase the probability of conventional conflict. Both sides know there is a ceiling on escalation, and both sides attempted to use that knowledge by pushing conflicts up to but not over the ceiling, knowing the other side faces the same constraint. What makes this paradox philosophically interesting beyond its Cold War context is the structure it reveals. Mechanisms designed to prevent the worst outcomes can create conditions that make intermediate bad outcomes more likely. The safety net installed at the bottom of the fall may encourage more reckless climbing. The most extreme risk has been taken off the table, which changes how people think about the risks that remain. Imagine a company that installs a very generous safety net for employees who fail, performance bonuses for the very best outcomes, protection from catastrophic personal consequences for failure, a culture that celebrates trying things that might not work. This sounds like a good environment for risk-taking and innovation. And in some ways it is, but it might also make certain kinds of intermediate failure more common, because the most catastrophic risk has been removed and people can take more chances with resources, relationships, and trust because the consequences of failure are now bounded. Whether removing catastrophic risk increases or decreases overall risk-taking and what kinds of risks get taken is something that different research programs find different answers to, depending on the domain and the population and the nature of the safety net. What is clearer is that the relationship between reducing extreme risk and reducing overall risk is not straightforward. Sometimes they move together, sometimes they move in opposite directions. Financial regulation has its own version of the Stability-Instability Paradox. When governments provide explicit or implicit guarantees to large financial institutions, those institutions know that certain kinds of failure will be prevented by public intervention. Knowing that catastrophic failure has a flaw can encourage more risk-taking in the middle range, not less. The protection against the worst outcome may create the conditions for more frequent bad outcomes because the worst-case cost has been socialized while the gains remain private. Whether this is what actually happened in the financial crisis of 2008 is contested, but the structure of the argument, that protection against catastrophic risk can encourage risk-taking in the middle range, is one that serious economists take seriously. Imagine applying the Stability-Instability Paradox to your own life. Where have you installed safety nets that have made you more reckless in the range of behavior those nets were meant to protect against? The safety net of a supportive family might make you more willing to take financial risks you would not take if failure had no cushion. The safety net of a stable relationship might make you less careful about the smaller things that sustain a relationship over time. The safety net of excellent health insurance might make you less careful about your health in the day-to-day. None of this is a reason to remove safety nets. Catastrophic risks are worth preventing even if prevention has unintended consequences in the middle range. What it is a reason to do is notice the unintended consequences because they are real and they tend to accumulate in ways that are hard to see from inside the protected zone. Stability at the extreme level creating instability in the middle is a pattern that shows up in ecology, in finance, in international relations, in personal psychology. Wherever the worst outcomes have been made sufficiently unlikely, something shifts in how the less bad outcomes are approached. Whether the places in your life where you feel most stable are also the places where you are taking the most risks, you have not quite noticed, is a question that the Stability-Instability Paradox suggests might be worth examining with some honesty. What is the thing you have been doing more recklessly than you would if the safety net beneath it were not there? And does knowing the net is there change how you feel about the recklessness, or does it just explain it? Sam Peltzman, an economist at the University of Chicago, documented a version of this in road safety research in the 1970s. He found that mandatory seatbelt laws, rather than reducing traffic fatalities in proportion to the protection they provided, produced a smaller reduction than expected. His explanation was that drivers, feeling safer because of the seatbelt, drove slightly more aggressively. The protective technology changed the risk calculation at the driver level, leading to behavior that partially offset the protection the technology was supposed to provide. Whether the Peltzman effect is as large as his original estimate suggested has been debated by researchers ever since. Most subsequent work finds a real but smaller effect than Peltzman claimed. What is harder to argue with is the underlying mechanism. Protection changes behavior, and behavior change can partially cancel out protection. This does not mean seatbelts are bad. Seatbelts save enormous numbers of lives even with behavioral compensation. What it means is that the relationship between protection and safety is not as linear as it might appear. The same dynamic shows up in how people respond to financial cushions. Research on people with emergency savings funds consistently finds that having a buffer against catastrophe does change how people think about medium-sized financial risks. This is mostly good. People with financial resilience can take the career risks, make the investments, and weather the disruptions that produce long-term well-being. But occasionally, the cushion enables a pattern of risk-taking in the medium range that would not be sustainable without it. Whether your own relationship to your safety nets, financial, relational, professional, is enabling productive risk-taking or making you less careful than the medium-range risks warrant, is a question that requires honest examination of your actual behavior rather than your intended behavior. Imagine auditing one area of your life where you know you have a safety net and asking honestly whether the net has changed how carefully you walk on the tightrope above it. Not to remove the net, but to understand what it is actually doing to your behavior and whether that behavior is what you would choose if you saw it clearly. What stability in your life has been quietly making you less careful about something you thought you were taking seriously? And is the less careful version of yourself better or worse off for having the stability beneath it? Hyman Minsky, the economist, argued that economic stability itself sows the seeds of instability. Periods of stable growth lead financial institutions and households to take on more debt and more risk, because stability produces confidence, and confidence erodes caution. The longer stability persists, the more leveraged the system becomes, until eventually a relatively small shock causes a cascade that the over-leveraged system cannot absorb. Stability breeds instability not immediately, but over time, as the memory of instability fades and the habits of caution that instability produced are gradually replaced by the habits of confidence that stability encourages. Minsky described this cycle as built into the nature of capitalism itself, rather than produced by external shocks. Imagine a version of your own life over a long enough time horizon, where the periods of security and stability were precisely the periods when the conditions for the next disruption were being quietly assembled. Whether that framing is accurate depends on your specific history, but the structure of it is worth sitting with. What is the most stable thing in your life right now? And what is it allowing you to do or avoid that you would not be doing or avoiding if the stability were not there? The sword and shield paradox. Imagine a weapons dealer standing in a market, holding up a spear and a shield, and making the following claims. This spear, he says, is so sharp and so powerful that it can pierce any shield ever made. And this shield, he continues, is so strong and so perfectly constructed that no spear ever made can pierce it. A member of the crowd raises a hand and asks the obvious question: what happens when you use the spear to strike the shield? The dealer has no answer. He has made two claims that cannot simultaneously be true. A spear that can pierce any shield and a shield that can resist any spear cannot coexist. One of the claims must be false, or both must be, but both cannot be true in the same universe. This paradox comes from ancient China, attributed to a story in the philosophical text of Han Feizi, where a merchant made exactly these contradictory claims about his wares. The Chinese word for contradiction, maodun, literally combines the words for spear and shield and comes directly from this story. Every time a Chinese speaker uses the word for contradiction, they are invoking a 2,000-year-old logical puzzle about a weapons dealer who promised too much. What makes the sword and shield paradox more than just a historical curiosity is the way the same logical structure keeps appearing in very different contexts. Anytime someone claims to have an unstoppable force and an immovable object in the same system, they have created a version of this paradox. And systems that contain this structure tend to be unstable in specific ways, not necessarily in the dramatic sense of immediate collapse, but in the sense of containing an unresolvable tension that will eventually need to come out somewhere. Imagine a legal system that claims two things simultaneously: that every person is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and that certain categories of behavior are grounds for immediate preventive detention. The presumption of innocence is the shield. The grounds for detention are the spear. When the spear meets the shield, something has to give. Courts spend enormous energy working out which principle yields in specific cases, because the system cannot be logically consistent across all possible cases. Constitutional law is full of these tensions: free speech and national security, individual privacy and collective safety, religious freedom and anti-discrimination law. Each of these pairs contains a sword and a shield, and the legal system manages the tension through case-by-case adjudication rather than through a logical resolution that would eliminate it. Whether this is a failure of legal reasoning or the only honest response to a genuine tension in the values being protected is something legal theorists argue about without resolution. What makes this relevant beyond weapons and law is that the sword and shield structure appears in personal life as well. Imagine someone who genuinely holds two beliefs about themselves that cannot both be fully true. They believe they are completely honest, and they believe they always say what other people need to hear. Most of the time, these two beliefs coexist without friction, but there will be moments when honesty would require saying something the other person does not need to hear, or when saying what someone needs to hear requires being less than fully honest. At those moments, the sword meets the shield, and whatever happens next reveals which of the two beliefs actually yields when the pressure is on. Most people carry several of these internal contradictions without being particularly aware of them. Not because they are dishonest about their own values, but because the contradictions only become visible under the specific conditions that bring both values into play at the same time. You can believe in both loyalty and honesty for years without conflict, and then find yourself in a situation where loyalty requires saying something untrue, and discover in that moment which one you actually value more. Aristotle noticed a version of this in his logic when he formulated what is now called the law of non-contradiction. A thing cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. A spear that can pierce every shield and a shield that can resist every spear cannot both exist. But Aristotle's point was broader than just weapons. Any system of beliefs or claims that contains a genuine contradiction will eventually reveal that contradiction, because the world will eventually present the conditions under which both claims cannot simultaneously hold. Whether this means you should audit your own beliefs for internal contradictions is a question the paradox raises without fully answering. Most people find that their lives function fine with some level of internal inconsistency, because the specific conditions that bring the contradictions into conflict are relatively rare, but when they do arise, the unresolved tension produces a moment of genuine difficulty that no amount of prior consistency can prevent. Imagine holding two things you believe simultaneously, one of which is the spear, and one of which is the shield. Most of the time they coexist peacefully in separate compartments of your thinking. And then one day the situation arrives where both are in the same room, pointing at each other. What are the two things you believe most firmly that would not survive being pressed against each other at the same time? And does knowing they exist in tension with each other change how confidently you hold either of them? There is a version of the sword and shield paradox that appears in the philosophy of omnipotence, and it has been a genuine puzzle in theology for centuries. Can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift it? If yes, then there is something it cannot do, namely, lift the rock, which means it is not all-powerful. If no, then there is something it cannot do, namely, create such a rock, which also means it is not all-powerful. If no, then there is something it cannot do, namely, create such a rock, which also means it is not all-powerful. Either way, the claim of omnipotence seems to undermine itself when pressed. Theologians have developed various responses to this puzzle. Some argue that omnipotence does not mean the ability to do literally anything, but rather the ability to do anything logically possible, and that creating a rock too heavy for an all-powerful being to lift is not logically possible, rather than just practically difficult. Others argue that the puzzle reveals a genuine tension in the concept of omnipotence that requires a more careful definition. Still others find the puzzle trivial and unworthy of serious engagement. Whether the omnipotence puzzle is deep or shallow probably depends on how seriously you take the underlying concept. What it shares with the original sword and shield paradox is the same logical structure. A claim to an absolute property, the ability to do anything, runs into itself and creates a contradiction. Absolute claims tend to do this. Whenever you encounter someone claiming that something is always true without exception, it is worth asking what happens when the always true thing meets its own exception. Graham Priest, the logician who has written extensively on contradictions and their role in logic, argues that some contradictions are not necessarily errors to be resolved, but features of reality that logic needs to accommodate. His position, called dialetheism, holds that some propositions are both true and false simultaneously, and that the classical law of non-contradiction should be relaxed rather than treated as absolute. Whether this is a radical insight or a philosophical curiosity is itself contested. What is less contested is that the sword and shield structure keeps appearing because the world contains genuine tensions between things we value, principles that each seem fully correct until they meet each other directly. No amount of careful reasoning can eliminate these tensions because they are not primarily the result of unclear thinking. They are the result of values and principles that are each genuinely worth holding, but that are not always compatible. Imagine a system, a relationship, an organization, a set of personal principles that contains a genuine sword and shield tension that has never been directly tested. What would happen when the test finally arrived is not something you can know in advance, and the not knowing is itself information about where the real commitments lie. What is the unresolved tension in something you care deeply about that you have been managing by keeping the sword and the shield in separate rooms? And what do you think would actually happen if they ended up in the same room at the same time? When you are in the middle of a situation where two things you value are in direct conflict, the experience is rarely one of logical clarity. It tends to feel like being pulled in two directions without any obvious resolution. The paradox becomes visible as a feeling before it becomes visible as a thought. Both things pulling at you are real and valid. You are not confused because you have the wrong values. You are in conflict because you have the right values in a situation where they cannot both be fully honored. Whatever resolution arrives will leave something unresolved. Imagine sitting with a conflict that cannot be cleanly resolved. Whether that sitting produces anything useful or just makes the conflict more visible depends on what you do with the visibility. The Crocodile Paradox. Imagine standing at the edge of a river. A crocodile has just taken your child. Before you can do anything, the crocodile turns and makes an offer that is unusual even for a talking crocodile. If you can correctly predict what I am going to do, he says, I will return the child. If your prediction is wrong, I will not. You have one guess. You think for a moment, and then you say, you are not going to give the child back. Now the crocodile is in trouble. If he gives the child back, your prediction was wrong, which means under the terms of the deal he should not give the child back. But if he does not give the child back, your prediction was correct, which means under the terms of the deal he should give the child back. Either action he takes violates the terms of the agreement he constructed. He cannot honor his own promise in any consistent way. This is the Crocodile Paradox, one of the oldest logic puzzles in recorded history, discussed by ancient Greek philosophers and appearing in various forms across cultures for over 2,000 years. What makes it remarkable is that the trap was not set by you. You did not trick the crocodile with a clever semantic loophole. You simply made an honest prediction about what you believed the crocodile was going to do, and that honest prediction happened to be the one that made any consistent outcome logically impossible. The crocodile built the trap himself. By offering a deal that tied his promised action to your prediction of his action, he created a closed loop in which one of your possible predictions would always generate a contradiction. If you had predicted that he would return the child, there would be no paradox. He could return the child and honor both the prediction and the deal. But when you predicted he would not return the child, the deal became self-defeating. Your prediction, if correct, required him to do the thing that would make it incorrect. What the Crocodile Paradox reveals, once you look past the specific scenario, is a category of problems that arise when promises are tied to predictions about the behavior of the promise maker. Anytime someone says, I will do X if you predict I will do X, they have created a structure that can be exploited by a sufficiently strategic predictor. The promise's consistency depends on what the predictor says, which means the predictor has more control over the outcome than the promise maker intended. Imagine a job interview, where the interviewer says they will hire whoever does not want the job. Everyone who wants the job is disqualified by wanting it. Everyone who does not want the job has no reason to be there. The offer cannot be consistently implemented because the condition for qualification undermines itself in all possible cases. Whether this kind of self-defeating structure is rare in real life or fairly common depends on how carefully you look. Certain kinds of conditional offers in contracts and negotiations create versions of the crocodile problem, where the condition for fulfillment makes fulfillment impossible. Courts and contract lawyers have developed ways to handle these, typically by declaring the underlying agreement void, but the logical problem that created the voidness remains interesting. Conditional promises in personal relationships carry a quieter version of the same structure. Imagine someone who says they will trust you completely once you have given them a reason to trust you completely. But giving them a reason to trust you completely requires demonstrating trustworthiness in situations where you have not yet been trusted, which requires trust before the demonstration. The condition for trust requires the thing that only trust can produce. Like the crocodile's deal, the promise cannot be honored by any consistent chain of actions. Whether you have been in a version of this situation, where the condition for earning something was already assumed by the person offering it to be unachievable, is a question that tends to produce recognition in most people when asked directly. These structures are not rare. They are just usually not named. The Crocodile Paradox also has implications for how you think about the promises you make. Any promise whose fulfillment depends on conditions outside your control, or that is tied to conditions that involve predicting your own behavior, is potentially vulnerable to the same kind of logical trap. Not every such promise falls into the paradox, but some do, and recognizing the structure in advance is more useful than encountering it in the middle of trying to honor something you cannot honor consistently. Medieval scholars used the crocodile problem as a teaching example in logic, partly because it is concrete and vivid, and partly because it illustrates something genuinely important about the limits of self-referential conditions. A promise that refers to itself, or to predictions about itself, creates a loop that can become impossible to close. The ancient philosophers were right to take it seriously. Imagine designing a promise or an offer that could not be turned into a crocodile problem by any possible response from the other party. Whether that requires more careful thinking about the conditions attached to the promise than you would normally give them is something worth sitting with before the next time you say, "I will do X if you do Y." What promise have you made or been offered where the condition attached to it made it impossible to consistently fulfill? And did you notice at the time, or only afterward when the impossibility became undeniable? There is something worth noticing about the parent in this story that tends to get overlooked in the formal analysis. The parent did not outsmart the crocodile through elaborate reasoning. They made an honest assessment of the situation. They did not believe the crocodile was going to give the child back, and that honest assessment, stated plainly, created a logical crisis for a system built on a contradiction. Honesty, in the right circumstances, has a way of doing this. Systems maintained by a particular kind of dishonesty, by everyone agreeing not to notice the contradiction at the center, are often more fragile than they appear. When someone states plainly what everyone can see, but no one is supposed to say, the whole structure becomes harder to sustain. Whether the parent gets the child back in the story is something different versions resolve differently. Some tell it with the crocodile paralyzed, unable to act because either action violates the deal. Others have the crocodile act anyway, in violation of his own terms, which reveals something about what his promise was actually worth. Neither ending is particularly comforting from the parent's perspective. Robert Nozick, the philosopher, described a category of problems he called paradoxes of rationality. Situations where rational behavior for each party produces outcomes that seem irrational from the outside or that violate one party's stated intentions. The crocodile's deal is one of these. He intended to construct a deal he could not lose. Instead, he constructed one he cannot honor. Whether the lesson is about the limits of self-referential conditions, or about the danger of making promises based on predictions of your own behavior, or about something else entirely, is something the paradox leaves open. What it does not leave open is the logical trap. Once you have made a deal whose consistency depends on predictions about you, you have handed some of the control over the outcome to whoever makes those predictions. Imagine making a promise today whose fulfillment you can guarantee regardless of any prediction or response from the other party, where there is no version of the crocodile problem that could arise. Whether that is possible for the specific promises you tend to make is worth checking before you make them. What would happen to the agreements in your life if you examined each of them for the crocodile structure, for the self-referential condition that could be triggered by a sufficiently honest prediction, and are any of them more fragile than they appear? Protagoras, the ancient Greek sophist, faced a version of the crocodile problem in a real legal dispute. He had agreed to teach a student law and accept payment only after the student won his first case. When the student showed no signs of taking any cases, Protagoras sued him. The student argued, "If I win this case, the court says I owe nothing. If I lose this case, I still have not won my first case yet. So by our contract I owe nothing." Protagoras replied with the mirror, "If you win, our contract says you owe me. If you lose, the court says you owe me. Either way I win." Both arguments are logically valid. Both cannot produce the same outcome. The two valid chains of reasoning lead to contradictory conclusions, which is exactly what the crocodile problem does in its original form. What the courts actually do in these cases is declare the contract void, rather than follow either argument to its conclusion, which solves the practical problem while leaving the logical one intact. Imagine trying to draft an agreement that would resolve the Protagoras dispute in a logically consistent way, where no version of the either-way argument could arise. Whether it is possible is something law schools use as a teaching exercise precisely because it is not obvious that it is, and the crocodile is still waiting by the river. Schrödinger's cat. Imagine a sealed box. Inside the box is a cat, a small amount of radioactive material, and a device that will break a vial of poison if a single radioactive atom decays. Radioactive decay is governed by quantum mechanics, which means before you observe it, the atom exists in a superposition of having decayed and not having decayed. Both possibilities are simultaneously real. Both outcomes exist at once until a measurement forces the system to choose. Now apply the same logic to the cat. If the atom is in superposition, and if the cat's fate is directly linked to the atom, then the cat should also be in superposition. Both alive and dead simultaneously, existing in both states at once until you open the box and look. A thing that is unambiguously alive and a thing that is unambiguously dead, existing as the same thing at the same moment, waiting for your observation to force it into one state or the other. Erwin Schrödinger devised this thought experiment in 1935, not because he thought cats could actually be both alive and dead, but because he found the conclusion so obviously absurd that it had to reveal something wrong with how quantum mechanics was being interpreted. He was writing a letter to Albert Einstein, trying to show that the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which holds that particles do not have definite properties before they are observed, led to ridiculous conclusions when applied to macroscopic objects. A cat is not a particle. A cat is either alive or dead. And yet the equations, followed consistently, said otherwise. What Schrödinger intended as a reductio ad absurdum, an argument designed to reveal a flaw in the position it extends, instead became one of the most enduring illustrations of what makes quantum mechanics genuinely strange. Nearly 90 years later, physicists have still not reached consensus on what the thought experiment actually reveals about the nature of reality. The cat is still in the box. And whether it is alive or dead before you look is still, in a serious technical sense, an open question. The Copenhagen interpretation, the most widely taught and historically dominant approach, says the cat is in a superposition of alive and dead until observation collapses the wave function to one definite state. What you see when you open the box is what becomes real. Before you open it, asking whether the cat is alive or dead is not a well-formed question. Many physicists find this uncomfortable but workable. The equations produce correct predictions. Worrying too much about what is happening before measurement is, on this view, a category error, the kind of question that has no answer because the answer depends on the measurement that has not yet been made. Whether that is a satisfying response or just a sophisticated way of refusing to engage with the question is something physicists and philosophers of physics continue to argue about. The many worlds interpretation offers a different answer. When you open the box, the universe branches. One version of you opens the box and finds a living cat. Another version opens the box and finds a dead cat. Both outcomes occur. Both are real. No collapse happens. What looks like a choice between outcomes is actually a splitting of everything into parallel instances, each one as real as the others. Whether this is more or less disturbing than Copenhagen is a matter of personal philosophical temperament. What makes Schrödinger's cat genuinely life-changing as a thought experiment, rather than just a physics curiosity, is what it asks about the role of observation in constructing reality. If the state of the system is genuinely undetermined before measurement, then observation is not passive. Observation participates in producing what is observed. And if that is true at the quantum level, the question of whether something analogous is true at larger scales becomes one of the more interesting questions you can ask. Imagine whether the states of things in your own life, relationships, possibilities, futures that have not yet resolved, share anything with the cat in the box. Not in the technical quantum sense, but in the experiential sense that some things are genuinely undetermined until a decision is made, a conversation is had, a moment arrives that forces resolution. Whether holding those things in a kind of superposition until you have to open the box is better or worse than forcing a resolution before the moment requires it, is something only specific situations can answer. The measurement problem, the question of what counts as an observation and how the definite classical world emerges from the quantum superpositions underlying it, is still technically unsolved. Decoherence theory, developed in the 1970s and 1980s, provides a practical explanation for why we do not see macroscopic superpositions in everyday life. Quantum systems interact with their environment so rapidly and extensively that superpositions become effectively classical before they could ever be observed. But whether decoherence fully resolves the measurement problem or just explains why we do not notice it is itself debated. What would it change about how you relate to uncertainty if you took seriously the possibility that some things are genuinely undetermined rather than just unknown, not the same as not knowing what is in the box, genuinely both at once, until you look? Is there something in your life right now that you have been treating as already decided, where you have been acting as if you know what is in the box before you have actually opened it? Pilot wave theory, sometimes called Bohmian mechanics, offers yet another interpretation. On this view, particles always have definite positions and momenta, guided by a real physical wave function. The apparent randomness of quantum mechanics is not fundamental randomness, but reflects our ignorance of these hidden variables. The cat is always either alive or dead before you open the box. You just cannot know which until you look. Whether this preserves common sense at the cost of introducing hidden variables that no experiment can currently detect is the objection its critics most often raise. What is striking about the state of quantum interpretation is not that physicists disagree, but that they have disagreed for nearly a century without the disagreement becoming resolvable by experiment. All the major interpretations make the same predictions for every experiment that can currently be performed. The disagreement is not about what the mathematics says, but about what the mathematics means, which is a philosophical disagreement masquerading as a physics disagreement. Roger Penrose has proposed that the resolution to the measurement problem involves gravity, that there is a gravitational mechanism that collapses wave functions at a certain scale, and that this is why cats are never actually in superposition, even though electrons are. His proposal has not been confirmed experimentally and faces serious theoretical objections, but it represents one approach to taking the question seriously rather than defining it away. Imagine being a physicist who has spent 40 years working with quantum mechanics and still genuinely does not know what it means for a system to be in superposition before measurement. Whether that uncertainty is philosophically uncomfortable or just professionally interesting depends on the physicist. What most of them agree on is that the question is real, that the standard answer learned in introductory physics is at best incomplete, and that whatever the full answer turns out to be, it will probably require revising something we thought we understood about the relationship between observation and reality. What does it mean for something to be genuinely undetermined rather than just unknown to you? And is there a version of that distinction that applies to something you are currently treating as settled? Whether the cat is alive or dead before you look is the question Schrödinger asked. Whether the things you have not yet looked at are genuinely open or already fixed is a different question, but it is not entirely unrelated, and the answer probably depends on what kind of universe you think you are living in. There is a version of this that appears in everyday decision-making that most people have encountered without having a name for it. Imagine a relationship a job offer, a creative project, something genuinely uncertain whose outcome depends partly on what you decide to do next. Before you act, both outcomes are possible. The moment you act, something collapses, one future becomes actual. The others recede into what might have been. Whether the act of deciding is more like quantum measurement, where observation genuinely changes what is real, or more like opening a box that already contained a definite answer, is something you cannot usually know in advance. Telling the difference, before the fact, is one of the harder things that life asks of you. Imagine holding genuine uncertainty without rushing to close it. Whether the cat was alive the whole time, or only became alive when you looked, is not always something you can tell from the outside. What would it change about how you act in genuine uncertainty if you believed your action was genuinely participating in producing one outcome rather than just revealing what was already there? And would that belief make you more careful, or less, about the moments when you are about to open the box? The Ship of Theseus. Imagine a ship, not just any ship, but the legendary Ship of Theseus, the hero of Athens, preserved in a harbor as a monument and a reminder. Over the years, the wooden planks begin to rot. One by one they are replaced with new planks, identical in shape but made of fresh wood. The mast rots and is replaced. The hull is repaired plank by plank, beam by beam, until eventually every single piece of the original ship has been replaced with a new one. Nothing original remains. Every molecule of old wood is gone. Is this still the Ship of Theseus? Most people say yes, without much hesitation. The ship has been maintained. Its identity has been preserved through the process of repair. What makes it the Ship of Theseus is not the specific matter it is made of, but its continuity of form and its unbroken history. The ship that exists now is connected to the original by an unbroken chain of small changes, each too minor to constitute a replacement of identity, the whole chain adding up to what we naturally call the same ship. Now add a complication. A collector has been saving every original plank as it was removed. He has kept them all, carefully stored, and now he assembles them back into a ship using the original materials in the original configuration. The original wood, the original shape, the original structure, no new materials at all. Which ship is the real Ship of Theseus? The continuously maintained ship has the history, the unbroken chain of identity through time. The reassembled ship has the original matter. Both have a claim. Neither can be dismissed. And if you are forced to choose, your choice will reveal something about what you think identity actually is and where you think it lives. This is the Ship of Theseus paradox, one of the oldest thought experiments in philosophy, traced back to Plutarch in the 1st century, and probably older. What makes it life-changing, rather than merely clever, is that it is not really about ships at all. Theseus's ship is a stand-in for everything that persists through change, and that category includes you. Your body replaces most of its cells over a period of years. The person you are physically is not the same collection of matter you were a decade ago. Much of what you think, believe, and value has also changed. Some of what was most central to your identity at 20 is peripheral, or gone at 40. The fears that shaped your childhood decisions may have little bearing on the decisions you make now. The relationships that defined you have changed, some of them fundamentally. Imagine asking whether you are still the same person you were 10 years ago, and taking the question seriously rather than dismissing it with yes, obviously. What has been maintained continuously enough to count as identity? What has been replaced so thoroughly that something genuinely new is here? And if some combination of both is true, which parts of you are more like the maintained ship, and which parts are more like the reassembled one? John Locke argued that personal identity, over time, consists in continuity of consciousness, specifically in the continuity of memory. You are the same person you were 10 years ago because you can remember being that person, because there is an unbroken chain of memories connecting then to now. David Hume disagreed, finding on introspection only a bundle of perceptions without any persistent self to be found, a ship with no captain, no continuous observer. Derek Parfit spent much of his philosophical career on questions of personal identity and came to a conclusion that many people find both liberating and disturbing. He argued that personal identity is not what matters. What matters is psychological continuity and connectedness, the degree to which your current psychological states are connected to and continuous with your past ones. And that continuity is a matter of degree rather than all or nothing. Whether this means that personal identity is a fiction is not quite what Parfit concluded. He thought identity was a real concept, but one that mattered less than people assumed. Two lives could be psychologically continuous to different degrees, and the degree was what mattered morally and practically, not the binary question of whether they were the same person in some metaphysically precise sense. What makes Parfit's view interesting for the Ship of Theseus is that it suggests the question might be wrong, not which ship is the real one, but rather what aspects of continuity matter for whatever purpose you are asking about. For commemorative purposes, the maintained ship might be what matters. For historical purposes, the original materials might matter more. For neither purpose is there a single correct answer that holds across all contexts. Imagine asking what it means for you to be the same person across a major change in your life, and which version of you should bear responsibility for what earlier versions did or receive credit for what earlier versions built. Whether that question has a clean answer is something the Ship of Theseus suggests it probably does not. What parts of who you are now were not part of who you were 10 years ago? And do those parts feel like additions to the same person, or like the beginning of someone different? There is a version of the Ship of Theseus that appears in organizations and institutions, and it is one of the ways the paradox has most practical relevance. A company founded 50 years ago by a specific group of people with a specific set of values and a specific product has almost certainly replaced every employee, every piece of equipment, every process, and probably most of the original values and products over that time. Whether it is the same company depends on what you think makes a company the same company. And that question turns out to matter a great deal when legal liability, cultural inheritance, and contractual obligations are involved. Courts have developed doctrine around this, and the doctrine varies by jurisdiction and by what kind of continuity is at stake. A company that acquires another company inherits its legal liabilities under some theories and not others. A company that changes its name and headquarters and business model but maintains an unbroken chain of corporate existence is legally the same entity, even if nothing else is. The legal answer and the practical answer and the philosophical answer do not always agree. What makes this more than a legal technicality is what it reveals about how identity functions as a social construction. We need ships to be either Theseuses or not, companies to be either the same or different, people to be either the same person or not, because social life requires stable reference points. The paradox reveals that these reference points are conventions rather than discoveries, useful agreements about what to count as continuous identity rather than facts we have found in the world. Parfit thought recognizing this was ultimately liberating. If personal identity is a convention rather than a metaphysical fact, then the question of whether you are the same person who did something in the past has a less definitive answer, which might make it easier to hold your past lightly rather than being fully defined by it. Whether the people around you will accept that lighter grip on identity is a different question. Whether the ship is the same ship matters less than what the ship is used for, and who gets to make that determination. Whether you are the same person matters less than what that continuity is being invoked to justify, and whether the invocation is honest. Imagine standing next to two ships in the harbor, one continuously maintained, one reassembled from original materials, and being asked to choose which one to put in the museum under Theseus's name. Whether the choice reveals something about your theory of identity or just about what you think museums are for is itself an interesting question. What does the story of who you are depend on the continuity of, and what would happen to that story if the continuity were interrupted and then resumed? When we say the maintained ship is the real Ship of Theseus, we are valuing continuity of history, of purpose, of narrative. When we say the reassembled ship is the real one, we are valuing continuity of matter, of original substance. Neither valuation is obviously wrong. Both track something genuine. Imagine applying that choice to yourself. If you had to choose between the version of you that maintains the narrative continuity of your life, the unbroken story from childhood to now, and the version that returns to your original material, to what you were before all the replacements and changes, which one would you call more real? And whether you can tell them apart from the inside is the question the paradox does not let you avoid. Most people feel both genuine connection to and genuine distance from the person they were 10 years ago. Something persists and something has changed, and both are real. Parfit thought the distance was more important than most people allowed. That the ship metaphor, taken seriously, reveals that what we call I is always partly a ship under repair, partly a ship of assembled fragments, and never quite the same vessel from one decade to the next. What would it change about how you relate to your own past if you held it slightly more loosely, as the history of a ship extensively repaired, rather than as the fixed record of a single continuous self? The Bootstrap Paradox. Imagine you are a composer. One afternoon, a stranger appears at your door, hands you a piece of sheet music, and tells you it is the most important thing you will ever play. You look at the manuscript, recognize immediately that it is extraordinary, and spend the next decade performing it, teaching it, building your entire reputation around it. You become famous for this piece, and then one day, in possession of a time machine, you travel back to leave the sheet music at the door of your younger self, knowing it will shape everything that follows. Now ask the only question that matters. Who wrote the music? You did not write it. You received it and passed it on. Your younger self received it and performed it without writing a single note. Nobody composed it. The music exists in a closed loop with no point of origin, no first composer, no moment of creation. It simply is, cycling through time, belonging to no one, having come from nowhere. This is the Bootstrap Paradox, one of the most disorienting implications of time travel, if time travel were possible. Named after the old phrase about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, which describes something physically impossible, the paradox describes information or matter that has no traceable origin because it travels in a closed causal loop. Effect precedes cause. The thing exists before the process that would have produced it. What makes the Bootstrap Paradox feel different from the Grandfather Paradox, the more famous time travel puzzle where you go back and kill your grandfather before your parents are born, is that nothing in the bootstrap loop is catastrophic. Nobody is erased. Nobody creates a contradiction in the obvious sense. Everything is internally consistent. The music was received, learned, performed, and then given back. The loop is closed. And yet something deeply wrong has happened because an extraordinary piece of music came from absolutely nowhere. Physicists who have thought carefully about closed causal loops note that they would not necessarily violate any known law of physics. General relativity permits solutions to its equations that include what are called closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back to their own past. Whether these could exist in the actual universe is unknown, but if they could, information could travel around them in exactly the way the Bootstrap Paradox describes. David Deutsch, the physicist and pioneer of quantum computing, argued that the Bootstrap Paradox is actually physically prohibited even if time travel itself were possible. His argument involves what he calls counterfactual complexity, a measure of how unlikely a piece of information would be to arise by chance. Sheet music of extraordinary quality carries enormous counterfactual complexity because random processes would almost never produce it. A closed loop, Deutsch argues, cannot generate this complexity from nothing. So even if a loop were formed, the information traveling through it would have to be something trivially simple, not something of the kind that would make you famous. Whether this resolves the paradox or just moves it to a different level is itself debated. Deutsch's argument requires assumptions about information that not everyone accepts, and even if his argument is correct, it does not tell us why complexity cannot arise from a loop, only that it apparently cannot, which is itself something that requires explanation. What makes the Bootstrap Paradox genuinely interesting beyond the physics is the philosophical implication it carries about origins and creation. Most people assume, without much reflection, that everything has a source. Every effect has a cause. Every piece of art was made by someone. Every idea arose in someone's mind. The Bootstrap Paradox describes a structure where this assumption fails completely, a chain of causation that has no first link, a history with no beginning. Imagine encountering an idea that genuinely changed how you think, and tracing it back through the people who passed it to you, and finding that the trail eventually becomes circular, that the idea influenced the very tradition that claims to have originated it. Cultural transmission in intellectual history actually does produce versions of this. Ideas travel, transform, and return to influence their apparent sources in ways that make clean origin stories impossible to tell. Whether genuine bootstrap loops exist anywhere in the actual history of human thought, or whether the apparent loops are always resolvable with enough historical research, is something scholars argue about. What the paradox does is make visible the assumption of origin that most thinking about ideas and culture takes for granted. Imagine holding an idea you feel you generated yourself and trying to honestly trace where it came from. Whether the trail leads back to a clear origin or dissolves into a network of influences that eventually circles back is something most people find difficult to determine when they actually try. What is the most original idea you believe you have had? And how confident are you that it did not arrive at your door the way the sheet music arrived at the composers? Stephen Hawking proposed the chronology protection conjecture as one possible response to the Bootstrap Paradox and to closed causal loops more generally. He argued that the laws of physics conspire to prevent time travel that would create paradoxes, not through any conscious mechanism, but through the natural behavior of quantum fields near the conditions that would permit closed time-like curves. Vacuum fluctuations near a nascent closed time-like curve, he showed in several calculations, would build up without bound and destroy the very space-time structure that would allow the loop to form. Whether Hawking was right is still not known. The calculations involved are technically difficult and involve precisely the regime where quantum mechanics and general relativity conflict, which is where our understanding of physics is least reliable. What he produced was an argument rather than a proof, and arguments, even from Hawking, can be wrong. What the chronology protection conjecture represents is an intuition about how nature probably works, an intuition that the universe likely does not permit the kinds of causal loops that the Bootstrap Paradox describes. Whether this is a deep truth about physical reality, or just a reflection of what we currently understand and what we currently find comfortable, is harder to know. Igor Novikov, a Russian physicist, took a different approach. Rather than arguing that closed causal loops cannot form, he proposed what is now called the Novikov self-consistency principle, that only events consistent with the entire history of the universe can occur. On this view, the bootstrap loop is possible, but only if the information in the loop is consistent all the way around. The sheet music can travel in the loop as long as no contradiction arises anywhere in the chain. Whether this counts as a resolution or just as a restatement of the problem in different terms is something physicists and philosophers continue to discuss. What both approaches share is a sense that the Bootstrap Paradox is pointing at something real about the relationship between causation, time, and the structure of events. The universe seems to have a preference for causes preceding effects, for origins existing before the things they originate, for information having a source rather than cycling without one. Whether that preference is a fundamental law or just a feature of the region of the universe we happen to inhabit is a question that remains genuinely open. Imagine the universe as a kind of narrative that requires each event to follow from earlier events in a coherent story. The Bootstrap Paradox describes a chapter that references itself as its own source. Whether narratives can do this, and what it means when they try, is something literature has been exploring for as long as there has been literature. What would it mean for something you created to have no origin, to simply be, without any moment at which it came from nothing? And would that make it more or less yours? There is a version of the Bootstrap Paradox that appears in personal identity over time, and it is one of the more quietly unsettling implications of the puzzle. Imagine that who you are now was shaped fundamentally by an encounter you had years ago, and that encounter was shaped fundamentally by who you were at the time, which was itself shaped by earlier encounters, going back further and further until the chain of influence becomes impossible to untangle. Where in that chain is the original you, the one that existed before any of the shaping had occurred? Whether there is such a thing, or whether the self is always already in a loop of mutual influence with its own history, is a question that the Bootstrap Paradox makes harder to dismiss as merely philosophical. Imagine trying to identify the you that exists independently of everything that has influenced you. Whether you find something there, or find the search circling back to its own beginning, is something only the looking can tell you, and the looking is itself a form of influence. The sheet music in the loop is not just a physics puzzle. It is a question about what it means to create something that might have always been coming toward you from a direction you could not see yet. The Barber Paradox. Imagine a small town with one barber. The barber is a man, and he has a very specific rule about his practice. He shaves all the men in the town who do not shave themselves, and only those men. Every man in town who does not pick up a razor shaves himself gets shaved by the barber. Every man who does shave himself does not go to the barber. A clean and simple rule. Logical, orderly, apparently without gaps. Now ask who shaves the barber. If the barber shaves himself, he falls into the category of men who shave themselves, which means the barber does not shave him, which means he does not shave himself. But if the barber does not shave himself, he falls into the category of men who do not shave themselves, which means the barber does shave him, which means he does not shave himself. Either way, a contradiction. Bertrand Russell devised this puzzle around 1901 as a simplified illustration of a much deeper problem he had discovered in mathematics, now known as Russell's paradox. He was working on the foundations of mathematics at the time, trying to build all of mathematics from a small number of logical axioms, when he found a contradiction at the very heart of naive set theory. Set theory, as it was understood in the late 19th century, allowed you to form sets of anything. The set of all apples, the set of all even numbers, the set of all sets that contain exactly 3 elements, and, crucially, you could define a set as the set of all things satisfying any property you could describe. This seemed completely reasonable until Russell asked about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Most sets do not contain themselves. The set of all apples is not itself an apple, so it is not a member of itself. The set of even numbers is not itself an even number, so it is not a member of itself. The set of all sets that contain exactly 3 elements does not itself contain exactly 3 elements, unless it happens to, so usually it is not a member of itself. These ordinary sets are the members of the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Now ask whether this special set contains itself. If it does contain itself, then it is a member of the set of sets that do not contain themselves, which means it does not contain itself. But if it does not contain itself, then it satisfies the condition for membership in that set, so it does contain itself. Same loop as the barber, same contradiction. This was not a minor puzzle at the edges of mathematics. It was a contradiction at the foundation. The rules that everyone had been using to build mathematical structures turned out to permit the construction of an object that both is and is not a member of itself, simultaneously. And if mathematics permits contradictions, everything built on it is suspect. Russell and Alfred North Whitehead spent years developing a new approach to the foundations of mathematics, eventually publishing Principia Mathematica in 3 volumes between 1910 and 1913. Designed to block the paradox by imposing a type hierarchy that prevented sets from containing themselves. Whether this solution is satisfying or just clever is something mathematicians and logicians have debated ever since. Ernst Zermelo developed a different approach around the same time, now called Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which handles the paradox by restricting which sets can be formed. Both approaches work in the sense that they block the Russell contradiction. Neither approach eliminates the feeling that something has been patched rather than solved. The contradiction arose from what seemed like a completely reasonable principle, and the fix consists of imposing restrictions that prevent that principle from being applied in full generality. Whether those restrictions are justified by something deeper than just the need to avoid the paradox is a question the philosophy of mathematics has not fully settled. What makes the Barber Paradox genuinely interesting for everyday life is not the mathematics, but the logical structure. Any rule that defines a category by reference to itself, that creates a set by specifying which things belong based on their relationship to the set itself, risks generating this kind of contradiction. An ordinary language is full of such rules. Imagine a club that admits anyone who has not been admitted by any club. Whether the club can admit itself is the Barber problem in social form. Imagine a law that requires every law to be publicly posted. Whether the law requiring posting must itself be publicly posted, and whether posting it counts as being publicly posted in the required way, is a legal version. Imagine a standard that defines good standards. Whether it meets its own standard is a management version. These loops arise naturally when categories are defined by self-reference. What rule in your own life or work defines membership in a category by reference to that category itself? And whether that rule runs into a Barber-style contradiction when you apply it to itself is worth checking before it becomes someone else's problem to notice. Kurt Gödel showed in 1931 that the approach Russell and Whitehead had taken, and indeed any sufficiently powerful formal system of mathematics, could not be both complete and consistent. Complete means every true statement is provable. Consistent means no contradictions are provable. Gödel proved that any consistent formal system powerful enough to express basic arithmetic must contain true statements that cannot be proved within that system. There will always be things that are true that you cannot reach from your axioms. Whether Gödel's incompleteness theorems resolved or deepened the problem Russell's paradox revealed depends on how you look at it. Gödel showed that the attempt to put mathematics on a complete, contradiction-free foundation is doomed not just by specific paradoxes that can be patched, but by something deeper about the nature of formal systems. Any system expressive enough to be useful will always contain truths it cannot prove. What this means for the Barber Paradox is that it was not just a local problem. Russell had stumbled onto a symptom of something systemic, a structural feature of sufficiently powerful logical systems that no clever redesign could fully eliminate. You can patch the specific contradiction. You cannot patch the possibility of contradiction arising from a sufficiently rich set of rules. Ludwig Wittgenstein had a different reaction to Russell's work, one that was characteristically oblique. He thought the paradox revealed not a problem with mathematics, but a problem with how certain sentences are being used. The sentence "the barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves" looks like it describes a possible state of affairs. Wittgenstein argued it does not, that it is a disguised nonsense rather than a description that happens to be contradictory. Whether his diagnosis is correct or just a different way of refusing to engage with the problem is something Wittgenstein scholars still argue about. What the Barber Paradox ultimately does is force attention to the assumptions that rules make about themselves. Most rules are designed for specific cases and do not explicitly include or exclude themselves. When you ask a rule to apply to itself, you often find either that the application produces a contradiction or that the rule simply has nothing to say. Both outcomes reveal something about the limits of the rule that was not visible from within its normal domain of application. Imagine asking every important rule in your life to apply to itself, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a practical check on whether the principles you use to make decisions are themselves consistent with those decisions. Whether you find contradictions is interesting, but what you find when a rule simply has nothing to say about itself, when the self-application just produces silence, is often equally revealing. What is the most important principle you use to navigate difficult situations, and what happens when you apply it to itself? There is something worth sitting with about how the Barber problem was discovered. Russell was not looking for a paradox. He was trying to build something, to put mathematics on a rigorous foundation, and the paradox emerged from the construction itself. He was following the rules carefully, doing what seemed like exactly the right thing, and found the floor giving way beneath him at a point he had not suspected was fragile. This is one of the ways paradoxes tend to arrive, not when you are specifically looking for logical problems, but when you are following a line of reasoning carefully enough that the hidden contradiction in your starting assumptions finally becomes undeniable. The Barber Paradox was not a quirk of mathematics. It was mathematics being honest about what it had been assuming all along. Imagine following a principle you hold carefully and consistently until it reveals the contradiction it has been quietly carrying from the beginning. Whether that kind of discovery feels like failure or like progress is something different people answer very differently. Russell found it genuinely alarming. Others have found similar discoveries clarifying. What is the assumption you have been following most faithfully that you have not yet tested to destruction? And what do you think you would find if you did? And whether you are braver or less brave than Russell for either asking or not asking. The Fermi Paradox. Imagine standing outside on a clear night and looking up at the Milky Way. There are somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars in our galaxy alone, and the observable universe contains roughly 2 trillion galaxies. Even by the most conservative estimates, the number of stars is so large that the number of zeros required to write it down is itself larger than most people can visualize. Among those stars, even if planets capable of supporting life are extraordinarily rare, the total number of such planets is still enormous. And among those planets, even if life itself is extraordinarily unlikely to arise, the total number of planets where life has arisen is still, by any reasonable calculation, enormous. and yet the sky is silent. No signals, no visitors, no evidence of any civilization beyond our own, no artifacts, no megastructures, no detectable modification of stars or planets that would indicate an advanced species was doing something to them. The universe, which by any reasonable prior probability should be teeming with intelligent life, appears to be almost completely quiet. Enrico Fermi raised this puzzle over lunch in 1950 with colleagues at Los Alamos, reportedly saying simply, "Where is everybody?" The question became known as Fermi's Paradox, and it has been one of the most discussed puzzles in science and philosophy ever since. What makes the Fermi Paradox particularly interesting is not just the silence, but the nature of the silence. A civilization even a few thousand years more advanced than our own could, given enough time and energy, spread throughout an entire galaxy. The timescales involved, while vast on a human scale, are short on a cosmological one. The Milky Way is roughly 13 billion years old. A civilization that developed 1,000,000 years before us would have had 1,000,000 years to spread. Even at a tiny fraction of the speed of light, that is enough time to reach every star in the galaxy many times over. And we detect no trace of any such civilization anywhere. The proposed explanations fall into a few broad categories. Maybe life is genuinely extraordinarily rare, far rarer than the naive probability calculations suggest, and we are effectively alone in the observable universe. Maybe life is common, but intelligent life is rare, the emergence of consciousness being a step that almost no biosphere ever manages. Maybe intelligent life is common, but technological civilization is rare. Maybe technological civilization is common, but almost all of them destroy themselves before developing the capacity to make themselves detectable at interstellar distances. Robin Hanson proposed what he called the Great Filter in 1998, arguing that there must be some step in the development from simple chemistry to galaxy-spanning civilization that is extraordinarily difficult to get through. Something filters out almost every potential civilization before it reaches the point of cosmic detectability. The terrifying question is whether the Great Filter is behind us, something in the deep past of evolutionary history that we have already survived, or ahead of us, something that tends to destroy civilizations at or after the stage we are currently at. If the filter is behind us, we may genuinely be among the first intelligent civilizations in our galaxy, which is lonely but not immediately threatening. If the filter is ahead of us, then the silence of the sky is evidence that something kills civilizations at roughly our current stage of development, and our future is considerably less certain than it might otherwise appear. What makes the Fermi Paradox genuinely life-changing, rather than just cosmically interesting, is what it asks about our own situation and our own choices. Every civilization that has ever existed, if they existed, faced the same basic question we now face about how to develop technology, how to manage the power it provides, how to avoid destroying themselves with what they have built. Whether any of them navigated that successfully, or whether the silence means they could not, is something we cannot know but cannot ignore. Nick Bostrom, the philosopher, has pointed out that finding life of any kind elsewhere in the universe, especially complex life or intelligent life, would actually be terrible news rather than good news. Not because the life itself would be threatening, but because it would update the probability that the Great Filter is ahead of us. If life arises easily and develops complexity easily, and we still see no advanced civilizations, then something must be killing them. And finding evidence that life develops easily increases the probability that the killing thing is ahead of us, rather than behind us. Imagine the moment we detect a signal from another civilization, unambiguous and unmistakable, and instead of celebration, the first response of anyone who has thought carefully about the Fermi Paradox is a cold feeling that something has just gotten worse. Whether the silence of the sky is reassuring because nothing is coming, or terrifying because of what it implies about why nothing is coming, depends on which interpretation of the Fermi Paradox you find most plausible. And the honest answer is that we do not have enough evidence to distinguish between them. What does the silence of the universe tell you about how rare or common our situation actually is? And does thinking about it change anything about how you feel about the choices that are being made right now by the one civilization we know is here? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, has been scanning the sky for radio signals and other evidence of technological civilizations for over 60 years. So far, nothing definitive has been found. The famous WOW signal in 1977, a strong narrowband radio signal detected at the Ohio State University radio telescope, has never been explained and has never repeated. Whether it was of natural or artificial origin is still unknown. Every other candidate signal has eventually been explained as interference, natural phenomena, or human-made sources. Whether 60 years of search is long enough to draw meaningful conclusions is itself a question. The universe is vast and we have sampled only a tiny fraction of it. Our radio telescopes have limited sensitivity and can only detect certain kinds of signals at certain distances. A civilization that had moved beyond radio communication to something we do not yet understand would be invisible to our current methods. The absence of detection is not necessarily evidence of absence, especially given how limited our detection methods are relative to the scale of what we are searching. Still, the silence is real. Whatever the explanation, we live in a universe that is apparently not producing detectable signs of advanced civilization in our neighborhood, and our neighborhood, astronomically speaking, is larger than most people can comfortably hold in mind. Jeff Marcy, one of the astronomers who discovered many of the first exoplanets, has described the Fermi Paradox as the most profound question in all of science, not because of what we know, but because of what the answer, whichever answer it turns out to be, would mean. If we are alone, then consciousness and intelligence are events of almost incomprehensible rarity in a universe of almost incomprehensible scale. If we are not alone, then either the others are all gone, or hiding, or unreachable, or simply haven't gotten here yet. All of those answers are strange, none of them is comfortable, and the uncertainty, which is where we currently live, is strange in its own way. Imagine holding the question of whether we are alone in the universe, not as a background fact about the cosmos, but as something that actually changes how you relate to being here. Whether the thought that consciousness might be extraordinarily rare in the universe makes you feel more or less responsible for what you do with yours is a question worth sitting with. What would it change about how you spend a Tuesday afternoon if you genuinely believed you were among the first, or the last, intelligent beings in the observable universe, and is the answer that it would change nothing, or that the question is simply too large to feel real from the inside? There is a version of the Fermi Paradox that is more immediately personal than the cosmic one. Imagine that the silence of the universe reflects something about the ordinary difficulty of civilizations getting through certain stages of development without destroying what made them worth preserving. Imagine that the transitions we are currently navigating, between levels of technological capability, between old and new ways of organizing power and knowledge and violence, are the kinds of transitions that most civilizations do not get through. Whether that reading is accurate is something we cannot know. What it changes is the way you look at the ordinary choices being made in ordinary places by ordinary people, about how to use the capabilities we now have. If those choices aggregate into something that gets through the filter, the universe might eventually stop being silent in our neighborhood. If they do not, the silence will continue. And the choosing is happening now, here, by exactly the people who are currently alive, which is a strange and heavy thing to sit with in the dark. What do you think the silence means? And does the answer change anything about what you do tomorrow? The paradox of tolerance. Imagine building a society from scratch and deciding that tolerance will be one of its core values. Every belief, every viewpoint, every way of living gets a place at the table. No one is excluded for what they think or say or believe. The society is open, pluralistic, genuinely welcoming of difference. You have built something that most people would call admirable. Now imagine that one of the viewpoints at the table is a movement dedicated to destroying all the others. A political or ideological force that explicitly seeks to end pluralism, to eliminate the conditions that allow other viewpoints to exist, to turn the tolerant society into one that tolerates only itself. If you tolerate that movement the way you tolerate everything else, you are tolerating the thing that will eventually make tolerance impossible. If you refuse to tolerate it, you have violated the very principle you set out to embody. Karl Popper identified this tension in 1945, tucked into a footnote of his book The Open Society and Its Enemies. He was writing in the aftermath of what fascism had done to tolerant European democracies, and he was trying to understand the logical structure of the failure. What he found was not a failure of courage or vigilance, but a genuine paradox embedded in the idea of unlimited tolerance itself. A society that extends tolerance to movements dedicated to eliminating tolerance is not being consistent. It is being naive in a way that produces the opposite of what it intended. Popper's conclusion was not that tolerance should be abandoned, but that it cannot be unlimited if it is to survive. A tolerant society must be willing to suppress movements that threaten tolerance itself, not as a first resort and not joyfully, but as a logical necessity if the principle is to remain coherent over time. Unlimited tolerance, he argued, is self-defeating. Tolerance that cannot defend itself against intolerance will eventually be consumed by it. What makes the paradox of tolerance genuinely difficult, rather than just interesting, is that the solution requires exactly the kind of judgment that the principle of tolerance is designed to avoid. Who decides which movements are sufficiently threatening to tolerance that they should not be tolerated? That decision requires someone to draw a line, and drawing the line requires a standard that is not itself tolerance. Every application of the principle that tolerant societies should suppress intolerant movements requires a prior decision about what counts as intolerant enough to suppress. History is full of examples of majorities declaring minority viewpoints too dangerous to tolerate under the banner of protecting tolerance. Whether those declarations were honest applications of Popper's principle or convenient rationalizations for eliminating inconvenient dissent is not always easy to determine from inside the moment they are made. The principle is vulnerable to misuse in exactly the direction it is designed to prevent. John Rawls approached the same problem from a different direction in his theory of justice. He argued that a just society can legitimately ask its members to accept certain principles as conditions of participation, and that movements dedicated to undermining those principles can be excluded from the protections those principles provide. Whether this produces a principled distinction between legitimate suppression and motivated rationalization is something political philosophers continue to debate. What makes the paradox of tolerance life-changing rather than just politically relevant is the version of it that appears in personal and professional relationships. Imagine being genuinely open-minded, genuinely interested in perspectives different from your own, genuinely committed to hearing people out before drawing conclusions. These are valuable qualities. They make you someone worth talking to, someone who can change their mind, someone who can build real understanding across difference. Now imagine someone in your life who exploits that openness systematically, who uses your willingness to hear them out to advance positions or behaviors that undermine the very openness you are extending. At what point does continuing to engage become complicity rather than generosity? At what point does your tolerance of their intolerance make you responsible for what follows? Imagine having that conversation with yourself in a situation you have been in or are currently in, where the question of when to stop extending good faith has no clean answer. What the paradox ultimately reveals is that tolerance is not a passive stance. It is an active practice that requires ongoing judgment about the conditions under which it can continue. A tolerance that never asks whether it is being used against itself is not a strong tolerance. It is a vulnerable one. Whether you err on the side of too much tolerance or too little in your own life probably depends on your history and temperament as much as on your considered values. And the direction of your error probably has costs in both directions that you have not fully accounted for. What is the version of the paradox of tolerance that appears in your own life right now? And are you erring on the side of too much openness or not enough? And is there a way to know which error you are making before the consequences make it obvious? There is a version of the paradox of tolerance that operates at the institutional level in ways that have direct practical consequences. Democratic systems are built on the principle that political competition should be open, that any party or movement should be able to participate in the political process regardless of its platform. Germany's experience with the Nazi Party led to constitutional provisions specifically permitting the banning of parties that seek to undermine the democratic order. The German Basic Law explicitly includes what is called militant democracy, a democracy that can defend itself against movements that would use democratic participation to end democracy. Whether this model is correct, or whether the power to ban parties is itself too dangerous to be entrusted to any institution, is something democracies with different histories have answered differently. The United States takes an almost entirely speech-protective approach, allowing virtually any political movement to organize and campaign regardless of its stated goals. Other democracies have followed versions of the German approach. None of them has produced a system that everyone finds satisfactory. The difficulty is that the judgment about which movements are sufficiently threatening to deserve suppression has to be made by some institution. And any institution capable of making that judgment is also capable of making it badly, in ways that serve the interests of whoever controls the institution, rather than the principle of tolerance the institution is supposed to protect. Popper knew this. His original formulation was careful about exactly this problem. He did not say that intolerant movements should be banned as a first resort. He said that a tolerant society should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, as a last resort, and should do so only when the movement has begun to use violence or to suppress rational argument. Whether those conditions are met in any specific case is precisely the kind of judgment that is most likely to be distorted by the interests of the judges. What this means practically is that the paradox of tolerance does not have a clean institutional solution any more than it has a clean personal one. What it has is a set of difficult trade-offs, and honest societies acknowledge the trade-offs rather than pretending the principle resolves them. Michael Walzer, the political philosopher, argued that what tolerant societies actually protect is not tolerance in the abstract, but the specific practices and communities that compose a pluralistic society. On this view, what needs to be defended is not the principle, but the particular forms of life that the principle is meant to allow. Whether that reframing helps with the paradox or just moves it to a different level is something you can only decide by thinking about what, specifically, you are actually trying to protect. Imagine drawing your own line between what you are willing to tolerate and what you are not, and being honest about whether the line is principled or convenient, whether it holds up under examination, and whether it would hold up if the thing on the other side of it were different from what it currently is the test that the paradox of tolerance ultimately applies to everyone who tries to navigate it. What is the thing you refuse to tolerate in the name of protecting something you value? And would you apply the same standard if it were a different thing that you found less convenient to refuse? Popper was careful about this. His original formulation said tolerant societies should claim the right to suppress intolerant movements only as a last resort, and only when the movement has begun to use violence or suppress rational argument. Whether those conditions are met in any specific case is the judgment most likely to be distorted by the interests of the judges. What the paradox of tolerance ultimately asks is not whether you will be tolerant, but what you think tolerance is for, and whether your answer is consistent with how you actually behave toward the people and ideas you find most difficult. Catch-22. Imagine being a pilot in World War II, flying bombing missions over heavily defended targets day after day. The missions are genuinely dangerous. The flak is real. The probability of dying on any given mission is not trivial, and the probability of surviving a full tour of duty is low enough that rational people think about it. You want out. You want to be declared unfit for duty on psychological grounds, because anyone who keeps flying these missions knowing what they know must be at least somewhat out of their mind. So you go to the flight surgeon and ask to be grounded. You explain that you are afraid, that the missions are terrifying, that you do not want to die, and the surgeon looks at you and explains the catch. To be grounded for psychological reasons, you have to be crazy, but wanting to be grounded because you are afraid of dying is a perfectly rational response to a genuinely dangerous situation. A person who does not want to die is not crazy. A person who wants to keep flying dangerous missions, despite knowing the risks, now that would be unusual. The very act of asking to be grounded proves that you are sane, and sanity means you have to keep flying. Joseph Heller invented this specific scenario for his novel Catch-22, published in 1961, and the phrase became part of the language almost immediately. People recognized something in it that they had felt before, the experience of a rule that defeats itself, a system that uses your own rationality against you, a structure from which there is no exit because every possible exit is blocked by the logic of the structure itself. What Heller captured was not just a military absurdity, but a universal structure. Any system that uses your attempt to comply as evidence that you should not be allowed to comply has this shape. Any rule that makes qualification depend on not trying to qualify creates a catch-22, and once you have a name for it, you start seeing it everywhere. The bureaucratic version is the most familiar. You need experience to get a job, but you cannot get experience without a job. You need a credit history to get a loan, but you cannot build credit history without a loan. You need to be employed to rent an apartment, but you need an address to apply for employment. Each of these is a small catch-22, a loop in which the thing required to enter the system can only be obtained from inside the system. Whether these are inevitable features of how complex systems manage risk or just failures of institutional imagination is something different. People answer differently depending on how much sympathy they have for the institutions. What is consistent is the experience of being caught in the loop, of trying to do everything right and finding that doing everything right is exactly what disqualifies you. Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist and communication theorist, described a related structure in family systems that he called the double bind. A double bind is a situation where a person is given two contradictory injunctions and is punished for responding to either one correctly. A parent who tells a child to be spontaneous creates a double bind because deliberate spontaneity is not spontaneous. A partner who says, "I want you to want to spend time with me," rather than feeling obligated, creates a double bind because telling someone what you want changes the nature of what they offer. The attempt to comply produces the failure to comply. Bateson argued that sustained exposure to double binds, especially in childhood, could produce patterns of thought and communication that were themselves paradoxical, because the mind had spent years trying to adapt to situations that could not be resolved by any consistent strategy. Whether his clinical conclusions have held up is contested. The structural observation that some systems are designed in ways that make all possible responses wrong is considerably harder to argue with. What makes Catch-22 genuinely life-changing, rather than just satirically useful, is the question it asks about how you relate to systems you are caught inside. Heller's protagonist, Yossarian, eventually concludes that the only rational response to a system maintained by a genuine Catch-22 is to stop taking the system's own logic seriously. Not to fight it, not to comply with it, but to recognize it as a structure that has no legitimate claim on your rationality and to act accordingly. Whether that is wisdom or just a colorful way of describing giving up is something the novel leaves open. What Heller was pointing at was something real about the relationship between individual rationality and institutional logic. Institutions can be structured in ways that make individual rationality irrelevant or actively counterproductive. And when that happens, the question of what to do about it is not one that more careful compliance will answer. Imagine identifying one Catch-22 in your own life or work, one system where the rules are structured such that compliance proves disqualification, or where every exit is blocked by the logic of the entrance. Whether noticing it changes what you do about it is something only the specific situation can determine, but not noticing it means continuing to apply your own rationality to a system that has no interest in your rationality and will not reward it. What is the Catch-22 you have been navigating most carefully without quite naming it? And what would change if you named it out loud instead of working around it in silence? Franz Kafka had been describing Catch-22 structures for decades before Heller named them. In the trial, Joseph K. is arrested and prosecuted for a crime that is never specified, under laws that are never published, by a court that operates in locations that shift without notice. Every attempt he makes to understand the system and mount a defense is interpreted by the system as further evidence of his guilt. His rationality, his persistence, his attempts to engage on the system's own terms, all produce outcomes that make his situation worse rather than better. Whether K is guilty of anything in any recognizable sense is never established. What is established is that the system does not require him to be guilty in order to process him as if he were. The Catch-22 in Kafka's version is that the court's judgment is not actually about guilt or innocence. It is about the court's own operations. Engaging with the court produces the court's conclusion, regardless of what the engagement reveals. Heller's novel is funnier than Kafka's. Yossarian is alive at the end and has escaped, after a fashion. K is not and has not. Whether the difference reflects American versus European sensibility about the possibilities of resistance or just a difference in the specific systems being described is something critics have discussed for decades without settling. Alan Watts described a version of Catch-22 that operates entirely inside the mind. Trying to relax creates tension, trying to fall asleep makes you more awake, trying to be natural makes you self-conscious. Every direct attempt to change a mental state produces the thing it was trying to eliminate. The self-conscious mind, applied to its own processes, becomes its own Catch-22. Whether this is a version of the same logical structure Heller identified in military bureaucracy, or just a metaphorical echo, is worth examining. Both involve a system where the act of engaging with the system produces the opposite of the intended result, Both create a sense of being trapped by one's own rationality. Both resist direct resolution. Helle spent years writing the novel and reportedly struggled to finish it because the logic of the world he was describing kept folding back on itself. Characters who tried to behave rationally ended up more trapped. Characters who abandoned rational compliance sometimes survived. Once you can see the catch-22 structure clearly, you stop blaming yourself for failing to comply correctly. The structure was designed in a way that made correct compliance impossible. That recognition does not automatically produce an exit, but it changes what you are looking for, and sometimes the exit was always there, just not visible from inside the logic that was keeping you looking the wrong way. The practical question the catch-22 always eventually produces is whether the system you are inside is one worth continuing to engage with on its own terms. Helle's answer, at least for Yossarian, was no. Yours might be different. But the question itself, asked honestly rather than avoided, is what the structure of the catch-22 finally makes unavoidable. What is the rule in your life that defeats you more completely the more carefully you follow it? And have you named it yet? Or are you still trying to follow it correctly? Most people never quite get to the naming.